The Tudors are historical superstars, our most famous royal dynasty. But there is one Tudor monarch who's been all but forgotten: Queen Jane. Lady Jane Grey was a teenager thrust onto the throne, only to lose her crown after just 9 days. She was the first woman to be proclaimed Queen of England, but few would recognise the name Queen Jane. I'm Helen Castor, and over 3 episodes, I'm going to take a forensic look at Jane's story. It's a Tudor thriller, an epic tale of family conflict, ambition, and betrayal. The death of a king covered up, and a country torn between 2 faiths. Our protagonists include the manipulative Duke, the wronged princess, and the God-fearing 15-year-old who finds herself caught between them and pays with her life. I'm going to track down original sources written as the drama unfolds. This is the really exciting bit of the job. I'll talk to expert colleagues.
I've been in this game for 40 years, and I have to tell you, there is no trickier Tudor subject than Jane Grey.
And I'll visit the places where Jane once walked during the 9 days that she reigned. In this episode, I'll unpick the story of the next 5 days of Jane's reign and the dramatic events that will decide the identity of England's Queen and its religion. It's the 12th of July, 1553. Jane Grey is queen, but Mary Tudor intends to do everything in her power to seize the crown. Jane is in the Tower of London. Mary's at Kenninghall in Norfolk. Jane has the support of the Privy Council, the whole machinery of state, and has the Tower's weapons at her command. Mary has none of these things.
No one believes she's got a chance. She's a woman with a household in East Anglia that's full of local, yokel Catholic gentrymen, nobody who's got any political experience. And instead, Lady Jane Grey is in the Tower of London, of course, the great fortress of the city, the armoury, the munitions, everything is under the control of Lady Jane Grey and the Duke of Northumberland. No one rates Mary's chances whatsoever.
Until just a few months ago, Mary, a devout Catholic, was heir to the throne. But her brother, Edward VI, who was determined that the country should remain Protestant, had secretly changed the succession in favour of their cousin, Jane Grey. When Edward died, a powerful group of noblemen, led by the Duke of Northumberland, declared Jane Queen before Mary could protest. On the 12th of July, it seems as though Jane and her supporters have won. Jane is confidently signing letters, Jane the Queen. But Mary, at her manor of Kenninghall, has also been sending out letters. Hers, signed Mary the Queen, summon her loyal subjects to resist Jane and to rally in support of her own claim to the throne. And by the 12th of July, this call to arms, issued by a lone woman, is beginning to work.
Mary's forces are able to gather together very quickly, 1, because they're local, and 2, because they believe in her cause.
And this is why she's gone to East Anglia in the first place, because she's also a major landowner there, so she's pulling all the threads of her possible roots of allegiance together.
Some of them would have been there because they had an obligation, being tenants of Mary. Probably a lot of them are Catholics, but even if they aren't Catholics, they believe she is the rightful claimant to the throne.
From farm workers to local landowners, men begin to arrive at Kenninghall to show their support. On the morning of the 12th, Mary makes the bold decision to relocate her gathering forces, of around 600 at this point, southeast to Framlingham Castle in Suffolk. Why would Mary take such a risk? And how does she manage the perilous journey with such limited resources? Mark,
Hello, Helen. Nice to meet you.
lovely to meet you. Jane's in the Tower, Mary's in Norfolk with her cobbled-together forces, and she has to move from Kenninghall to Framlingham. How did armies move with all their gear? How exposed were they on the road?
They'd certainly be visible. Moving around the countryside would draw attention. And the problem is she wants to move quite fast, so she's not got a huge baggage train with her. So men are living off the land, and because they don't have carts and things with them, they're most likely wearing everything that they're going to be needing. If we're looking at the sort of people who are coming out to support Mary, then we're looking at local militias, we're looking at people who are wearing maybe Grandad's old armour from Bosworth, or maybe not even as good as that.
So what was on their backs?
Well, this is called a brigandine. It's like almost like a modern army flak vest. And then, of course, we have the most important part of the body's armour, your head. So this is an armet. It's a very complicated continental helmet. You can't afford one of those if you're a local yokel. So I'm afraid if you are someone of the lower orders, you're going to be equipped with a simple skull cap like this.
A tin can?
Simply a tin can. A bit sturdy, not a thing of beauty, and more importantly, it doesn't really protect the face or especially the throat. Medieval and Renaissance warfare is brutal, it's up close, it's it's a tough guy's world.
Mary is leading her men over open country in active rebellion against Jane to a 12th century fortress that formed part of her East Anglian estates. Why did Mary come here to Framlingham?
Well, she was growing out of Kenninghall. I mean, Kenninghall was a manor house, but, you know, her forces were now gathering in several thousand, and so it really wasn't a place from which to mobilise a force or muster a force. And, of course, it wasn't a place where she could make a statement of her intent. And, of course, she'd by now proclaimed herself queen, so she needed a fortress, she needed a base from which to rally forces, but also get ready to engage for battle. And it's well situated, looks over the East Suffolk countryside. It would be a place where she could keep an eye out for forces from London, she could rally her troops, and it was somewhere which could be defended.
Mary's right to be on the lookout for troops from London as she makes her dash to Framlingham, because Northumberland is in the Tower readying an army to confront her. The 12th of July is a critical point in Jane's 9-day reign, with events moving swiftly on both sides. Local merchant Henry Matchin describes the ammunition and weapons he saw being brought into the Tower on the 12th. He recorded 3 carts full of all manner of ordnance, such as great guns and small bows, bills, spears, Moorish pikes, armour, arrows, gunpowder and stakes, a great number of cannonballs. With so much sophisticated weaponry, Jane and Northumberland have no reason to be concerned, so they take their time responding to Mary's challenge.
You would have thought, well, you know, she's got lots of peasants on her side. I have the guns, I have the cavalry, I have, you know, the power that matters.
Northumberland was the puppet master who'd placed Jane on the throne, the most powerful man in England, supremely confident in his abilities.
He was clearly an exceptionally skilled politician. He must have had outstanding interpersonal skills, as we would say today. He was non-titled, he was not hereditary nobility. Through his own sheer ability, he had worked his way up and become admiral of the fleet. He had served in the military and put down rebellions in the north. He was clearly someone who had enormous ability as a bureaucrat, as a governor, as a military leader, as a politician. And I think we need to admire him to a certain extent for that.
Northumberland has focused on securing the Tower and the machinery of state. It suggests that at this point, he doesn't see Mary as a serious threat.
Somebody said at the time about Northumberland, he despised the plans of a mere woman, meaning Mary, but he wasn't alone in that. They all underestimated her, and that was Northumberland's biggest mistake.
That he had Westminster blinkers on, that he thought if he controlled all the levers of power at the centre, everything else would just fall into place.
Exactly. But she was already gathering forces, but to his mind, not very impressive forces. They were largely the common people, ordinary people. They weren't the great nobles. The great nobles, on the whole, all supported Jane. He wasn't expecting Mary to decide to raise the standard and go to battle. That was a huge and tremendous shock, not just to him, but to the whole Privy Council. They simply couldn't believe it and were absolutely horrified.
And raising forces was a key question in all of this, wasn't it? Because the Crown didn't have a police force or a standing army at its disposal.
Yes, I think that's one of the interesting things about the English monarchy. They didn't have armies of their own. Certainly you could pay for them, and Jane did offer double the normal rate to anyone who was prepared to fight for her against Mary.
Despite offering high wages, Jane's camp struggles to attract an army. But people are joining Mary by choice. Why do they flock to her, even though she's the underdog? Why do so many ordinary people believe in her claim to the crown? To find answers, we need to go back to her childhood. What was Mary's life like in the years before the succession crisis of 1553?
Well, how long have you got? She had an epic life. I mean, Mary's life to be characterised by fortune and adversity. I mean, it swung from royal favour to profound neglect. She was born, of course, the first child of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, and was described at the time as a token of hope. But then, of course, it all changed with Henry becoming infatuated with Anne Boleyn, and then the 20-year marriage between Mary's parents was, of course, as we all know, brought to an end with the break with Rome. And with the birth of Elizabeth, Mary basically went from being a princess to a royal bastard. She became the king's illegitimate daughter. She was stripped of her status. She became Lady Mary. Absolutely extreme turn of events.
When Henry divorced Catherine and then executed Anne Boleyn, Mary and Elizabeth were both declared to be illegitimate and cut from the line of succession. But later, Henry made clear that if his only son Edward were to die childless, he still wanted his daughters to inherit the throne.
During Henry's reign, by his will and by Act of Parliament in 1544, the succession is Edward to be followed in the event of Edward not having any heirs himself, first by Mary and then Elizabeth. So although both Mary and Elizabeth were actually regarded as illegitimate, they're back in the succession.
And so it was quite easy for Mary to say, look, I am the rightful heir under my father's will. That was approved not just once by Parliament, but in 2 parliamentary acts. And she was simply, defending her right.
But Edward, on his deathbed, removed his half-sisters from the succession again and undid what all of England considered the natural order.
I mean, basically, Edward thought that just like Dad, he had the right to dictate his own succession settlement. He was absolutely determined that he was going to exclude his 2 half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from the succession because he maintained that they were illegitimate, and of course they had been proclaimed as bastards by Parliament, by Edward's father.
But as far as the public were concerned, Mary had the blood claim to the throne, no matter what Westminster said. And there was another reason, just as powerful.
And of course, religion came very much into it because Edward had brought in a Protestant settlement with his advisors and was himself a bigoted Protestant. And of course, Mary was a Catholic.
Following on from his father's break with Rome, Edward had been intent on ridding the country of Catholicism. Church walls were whitewashed, statues and stained glass destroyed, and the prayer book was radically changed.
I think it's difficult to overstate how dramatic this change would have been. Religion was so fundamental a part of people's lives. To make even the smallest change in that would really undermine people's sense not only of faith, but of normalcy, of the sense in which that there was something that they could depend on and trust. If we take, for example, the removal of the sung masses for the souls of the dead, if you've always been taught that in order for your loved one's soul to go to heaven, you have to have this sung mass, to suddenly have that taken away from you, well, not only do you worry about the soul of your family member or your loved one, but you start to wonder whether or not that was necessary in the first place, who gets to decide these things, is there any sort of foundational basis that you can trust in order to base your belief?
So your sense of the world, this life and the next one, is being changed before your very eyes.
I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just changes in the practice of religion, but changes in people's very mindsets. They're being told what to think and what to believe. And whenever you attempt to do that, you're going to create division. And that's exactly what we see happening.
In July 1553, the choice the country faced was not just Jane or Mary, it was Protestant or Catholic. Mary had no intention of abandoning her devoutly held beliefs. She had carried on celebrating the Catholic Mass even while her brother was alive, and that had caused a deep rift between them. We know this because, unusually for a king, Edward tells us himself. He kept a diary, not a record of his innermost thoughts, but a chronicle of the events of his own reign. Edward wrote his diary between 1547 and 1552. It's a remarkable document that gives us glimpses of Mary's past and helps explain what sort of opponent she was. This is the really exciting bit of the job. I've read the text of Edward's diary before, but I've never seen the original manuscript until today. Hello, Andrea.
Hi, hi.
Thank you so much for bringing this. It looks like it's holding up well.
Yes.
Oh, so it's got some of these letters to start with,
Some of
right
his
at the very
letters at the
beginning.
very beginning. This is a letter in Edward's hand. And this is the beginning of his diary.
18th of August, 1550. My Lord Warwick was made General Warden of the North, and Mr. Herbert, the shilling fell from 9p to 6p, the groat from 3p to 2. I wrote back a letter saying that I marvelled that he could refuse to sign that bill.
It's an extraordinary thing to read the King's own record of his daily life in his own handwriting, and to touch the paper that Edward touched is spine-tingling. The diary makes clear Mary's strength of character in resisting Edward's Protestant reforms.
Mary becomes this figure of opposition. Edward's young brother is going, right, we're going to really kick on with the Reformation. Mary is defiant in her Catholicism, and so brother and sister have these really full-on spats.
18th of March, 1551. The Lady Mary, my sister, came to me at Westminster.
She came, but she came with a show of defiance. She rode through London with 130 attendants, each one holding a rosary as a sign of their outlawed Catholic faith. Edward challenged his sister directly, and the two had terrible arguments.
Mary's saying to Edward, you know, you're my little brother. I'm not listening to you. I'm not taking orders from you. And he's saying to Mary, his older sister, but I'm the king. You need to stop saying Mass. And Mary's like, absolutely not. And massive pressure's been put on her. Some of her household officers are imprisoned for refusing to stop saying the Mass, or, you know, in Mary's household. And it really does get pretty emotional. But of course, it has a much bigger, dangerous, you know, context, which is Catholic versus Protestant. What is the future going to be?
Protestantism has marginalised and oppressed Mary, but her brother's death is her opportunity to claim the throne, and she's determined to grasp it.
She had survived the break with Rome. She had survived her brother's Reformation. And I believe she was intent on surviving this latest crisis as well.
She saw this as her kind of divine duty. You know, God was preserving her through these years in order to bring about the Catholic Restoration.
And in the attempt to achieve her goal, Mary had two important advantages. While some people had embraced the new Protestant faith, Large parts of the country were still attached to traditional forms of worship, and in Mary they saw a champion of the old ways. Not only that, but most people in England saw Mary as the rightful heir, while Jane was barely known, not a queen, but a usurper of the Tudor line. And as a result, increasing numbers of both Catholics and Protestants were rallying to Mary's cause. As Mary's support grows, Jane's camp are still planning their counter-move. In the Tower, the Privy Council have chosen Jane's father, Henry Grey, a duke with no track record as a military leader, to command the army against Mary.
So that's a bad idea. No military training, no military experience.
No ability at anything very much.
No, I mean, Henry VIII had deliberately excluded Henry Grey from the Garter for year after year after year after year. Henry VIII was a good judge of character. He knew what men had ability and what men did not.
Jane's father had ambition, but no discernible talent.
I think he had ambition and no ability and no desire to work toward that ambition. He wanted it handed to him on a plate.
The Order of the Garter was a chivalric honour given by the king, and Henry VIII hadn't thought Henry Grey much of a soldier. Now, sometime during the 12th, there was a change of plan. Some accounts say that Jane refused to let her father leave London because she was afraid it was too dangerous. Some say that Henry Grey had begun to have fainting fits. Perhaps he was ill, or perhaps the pressure was taking its toll. Jane decides to keep her father back in safety. Instead, she confirms that Northumberland will replace her father on the battlefield.
Of course, what Jane wanted was that her father, who'd been originally given the job, shouldn't do it. Jane did not want her father to risk his life and career by, riding out on a sort of risky expedition. And so they sent Northumberland instead. Northumberland was quite reluctant to go, of course, because he knew that if he left London, things could, collapse.
In that specific sense, then, in deciding that Northumberland must lead the army instead of her father, could we argue that Jane was the architect of her own fall?
Well, you could, but it wouldn't have been a conscious decision because she wasn't thinking of it in that sort of way. I mean, we still have to come back to the fact that Jane is really being used here by the men. I mean, she is queen, but only in a titular sense.
In sending Northumberland instead of her father, you could argue that Jane's made a rational choice. Northumberland's the most experienced soldier on the council, clearly the best man for the job, and she doesn't want her father to stick his neck out and be the person to arrest Mary. But it turns out that Jane's decision to let Northumberland leave London is a fatal error. Northumberland can't be everywhere at once, and he can't hold this coup together.
Had he had able lieutenants, and clearly Henry Grey was not that able lieutenant, things might have held together a little bit longer. But there was just no one there. All of the, quote, good people he took with him going north. And we were left with essentially older men, people of experience, but people who were not themselves known to be skillful politicians. They were administrators, but they were not politicians. And what was needed was a good politician, and that was Northumberland.
For good or ill, Jane has made up her mind. Northumberland is to lead the attack on Mary. He begins to position his pieces on the battlefield. What was Northumberland's plan before he set out from London in terms of what forces he was going to get and what he wanted to do with them?
Well, we place him here in London. At this stage, Mary, he knows, is in Framlingham.
Here in Suffolk.
Exactly there. And he's not overly concerned with time at this stage. Time, he thinks, is on his side because he and the Privy Council hold all the cards. They have control over the levers of power. Most of the military force, including the artillery in the country, are in his hands. And he cannot have believed that Mary can actually put a very effective military force in the field. Therefore, he needs to move slowly but surely to the west of her position and not come in from the south. If he'd actually marched through Chelmsford towards her, it would have given her the opportunity to leave by the northern route, as it were. So his plan is to move towards Cambridge, where he's going to link up with his son, and therefore they will effectively put themselves as a blocking force, not allowing Mary to move in a westerly direction. But she also can't move east either, because the Privy Council has ordered the Royal Navy, or at least 6 of the major warships of the Royal Navy, to move up and block the coast, preventing her from escaping, but also any imperial forces from aiding her. He has pretty much got her in his mind, or will soon have her, in the 2 jaws of a vice.
Strategically, Northumberland has the upper hand, and there's no doubt his forces are armed in a way Mary's men can only dream of. What kind of weapons were their soldiers going to be able to wield?
Jane's very lucky. She has all the arms and armour in the Tower of London. It's a huge national depository of pikes and bills and swords and bows and arrows. There might be a million arrows stored in there. But this is going to be a battle at close quarters, so we are looking at the swords. It's a cut and thrust sword, but this is really designed for going straight in. See here, this is the tin can opener of the 15th and 16th century. This is the poleaxe. This is going to go through armour. This is going to cut flesh. That's going to stab through any gaps. But again, it's a complicated weapon and it's an expensive weapon, and it shows that you're somebody of a decent rank. You are a man-at-arms, you've probably got a decent bit of armour. Some of Jane's more ordinary troops, you are looking at things like this. A glaive with a nasty fluke on it, so you can really push that home, and there's a secondary cutting edge there. We are getting into a very, very brutal, very, very nasty style of fighting. You can see that in the remains of soldiers who have been excavated from battlefields across the medieval world.
So should we imagine either Jane or Mary having any firepower at their disposal?
Well, Jane's got the Tower of London arsenal. We know there are muskets, arquebuses, and we know there's gunpowder and shot. Mary would have been reliant on anything that's local. They're few and far between, to be quite honest, compared with what Jane can bring to bear. But of course, they still need training. They still need people who understand. They still need people who understand how to not only use, but make gunpowder as well. It's a rare substance in England. Basically, if you have more gunpowder and more cannons than anybody else, then technically you've won. You can bring more stuff to bear.
Finally, at about 8 in the evening on the 12th of July, Mary arrives at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk and is greeted by an overwhelming display of support.
We know from accounts that when she arrives at Framlingham, the commons and gentry, several hundred, thousands are gathered in the deer park. So, which must be a kind of heartening experience to come here and see the local people here ready to greet her, ready to defend her. This was going to be the base, if you like, from which she was going to engage the enemy. So this was going to be really important for the next few days.
So to come here to a fortress, a stronghold, with an army camped outside, and to feel that she was embedded within the support of the local community.
Really important. I think she could probably, for the first time, maybe take a small sigh of relief, and then obviously galvanise herself, get ready to galvanise the army, ready for what would seem to have been the impending battle.
It's remarkable that in a matter of days, Mary has been able to rally such substantial forces.
No one expected Mary to be so organised. Mary had never shown this sort of capacity for organising, essentially, not only really anything of great substance, but also military force in that amount of time.
Mary ended the 12th in a far stronger position than she had begun it. The next 24 hours would prove critical. On the morning of the 13th, there's a frenzy of activity at Durham House on the banks of the Thames. Northumberland's army are about to ride out to Framlingham, and they are a formidable sight.
He's got very good reason to be confident. The military force that she has available to her, in his mind, is probably armed peasants. They will not be that effectively armed. He, on the other hand, has a much more experienced and well-armed force. Probably the total size of the force that he puts together is about 3,000 strong. And while that doesn't sound that many, 2,000 of those soldiers are cavalry, men-at-arms, who are heavily armored. In battle, they would have, looked like, almost like a tank. These are men clad from head to foot in armor, armed with lances and swords and maces, and they could do an awful lot of damage against poorly armed peasants. That's the sort of battle he's expecting. But just in case, he's also going to take along a very powerful artillery force of at least 30 pieces of cannon. And he must believe at this point, or at least he does believe at this point, that Mary is going to have no cannon to oppose him with. And so all the cards at this early stage seem to be in his favour.
As Northumberland prepared to leave, he took one last opportunity to address the council. He spoke on behalf of the whole army that now goes forth for the establishing of the Queen's Highness. He reminded them of the sacred, holy oath of allegiance made freely by you to this virtuous lady. Jane, he said, was only there by your and our enticement. And he warned them that if you mean deceit, God will revenge the same. Northumberland's speech, reported by someone who was in the Tower of London when he made it, betrays the fracture lines in Jane's council. This is an impassioned reminder that they signed their names to the device that put her on the throne, and they must stand by it. As Northumberland leads his army through the streets of London, the crowds gather to see him pass. But the cheering he expects doesn't come. And outside the capital, Northumberland can expect an even more hostile reception.
Northumberland, remember, is very unpopular in the country. Why? Because he's the guy who put down the popular revolts of 1549 using German and Genoese mercenaries.
Four years earlier, Northumberland had been dispatched to East Anglia, the very same place he's heading now, to put down a rebellion of local people with his well-armed troops.
Yeah, it all kicked off in East Anglia. And this was described as Kett's rebellion, led by Robert Kett. What motivates someone to go out and protest, just like today, is a variety of factors. But here in particular, it was socio-economic factors. It was people were really cross about large landowners enclosing land. And people just had had enough. People felt like they weren't being listened to, they weren't being respected, all of that. And so when a rebellion kicks off, it is always dangerous.
Northumberland's response was vicious. Ringleaders were rounded up and brutally executed. When he reaches Framlingham, he'll be facing people who remember the rebellion. People who have reason to hate him, who've joined Mary because they have a score to settle. Mary has now been at Framlingham for 24 hours, and gradually events are beginning to swing in her favour.
She looks out into the deer park and she sees local gentry, commons gathering. And of course, those people will become her army. For her, she believes that those will be the people who will secure the throne for her. You know, and these are unprecedented times. I mean, we have a woman fighting for the throne, and the gathered forces are looking at her as their military commander, as a woman. So completely unprecedented times, and they're happy to potentially lay down their life in defence of her claim to the throne. So, you know, the stakes could not have been higher.
Momentum is moving to Mary all the time, happening so rapidly over simply of days, sometimes even hours. So decisions are having to be made on a split second.
You know, you can almost count from morning to afternoon the vast increase in the number of people that are moving north to surround Mary, to protect her, to support her, and to promote her.
Grassroots support for Mary begins to have a surprising effect on the higher ranks of society, people who have until now been loyal to Jane.
The gentry are beginning to move to her. We have a lot of people with knighthoods, you know, the sort of sirs of the realm.
And there's one event in Ipswich, 20 miles from Framlingham, which appears to confirm the tide is decisively turning against Jane. It involves a local dignitary, one who's well respected in East Anglia, Sir Thomas Cornwallis. Sir Thomas Cornwallis is the Sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk. He's backing Jane, the Queen chosen by the Privy Council. Cornwallis gives Jane a strategically powerful ally and significant military resources. More significant still, because he's based in Mary's heartland. When one of Mary's men arrives at the marketplace in Ipswich and proclaims Mary the Queen of England, Cornwallis immediately protests. One eyewitness says that popular support for Mary was so great that Cornwallis stood in grave peril of his life for supporting Jane. Cornwallis realises that he's dangerously underestimated the popularity of Mary among the ordinary people. He comes here to Framlingham, where he gets an audience with Mary. He kneels before her and begs her forgiveness.
I mean, this is a big deal, and this is what we see gradually over the days of July, that in a way the impossible gradually becomes possible. People, significant figures in East Anglia, you know, the local lieutenants who would never, you would imagine, have declared for Mary, actually initially declare for Lady Jane and then change their allegiance.
The defection of Cornwallis isn't an isolated incident. Across the country, noblemen are finding themselves unexpectedly under pressure.
It becomes apparent that the common mood of the realm is pro-Marian.
Noblemen discovered that their tenants were refusing to fight for them. And just as a king needed his nobles to fight for him, nobles needed their tenants to fight for them. That's how it all worked. You know, everyone worked for everyone else. And again, if you're a nobleman and your tenants aren't going to support you, your affinity aren't going to support you, you're nothing. You're nobody. You're just a bloke.
The Earl of Oxford finds himself facing exactly this dilemma. When he's summoned to support Jane, dozens of his own men confront him. They say that if he doesn't defect to Mary, they'll go without him. And he has to give in. Oxford and his men join Mary's forces. We're seeing something extraordinary. How the feeling that Jane is the wrong woman on the throne has started with the people, but it's so powerful that it begins to force the political elite into action.
And that's what's so precarious in this July crisis, that some of these key figures in East Anglia who initially declare for Lady Jane then suddenly swing and support Mary. And it's by turning their loyalty from one side to the other that they basically bring an army of hundreds and potentially, you know, several thousand people in defence of Mary as opposed to Lady Jane, which makes all the difference.
Mary, the old king's daughter, is a powerful figurehead for whom people are prepared to lay down their lives. Jane is the exact opposite. So young and almost completely unknown, at this critical point, hidden away in the tower, she's a distant figure to the people whose queen she claims to be. As a privileged young girl, Jane's life had been sheltered. She saw little of the world outside her home and the royal court. And more significantly in this moment of crisis, the world had rarely seen her. This is the geography of Jane's world. There are 5 key places: Sion House, Chelsea, Durham House, the Tower of London, and Greenwich Palace. They cluster along the river, and for very good reason. Everyone depended on the river for travel. For Jane, it was the thread that connected the places in her life. The streets of London were narrow, cramped, and dangerous.
Hello, Mark. Yes. Lovely to see you.
Like the rest of the court, Jane relied on the relative safety and comfort of travelling by river.
Try and get in time. Stand up there. Number 2.
Is this the closest I'm ever going to get to being on a 16th century barge?
It really is, yes, other than the fact that this wasn't actually built in the 16th century, it's only 25 years old. This is, in effect, a 16th century barge.
Mark Edwards made the present Queen's barge, and this Tudor replica was built using traditional techniques. It's the same design, built in the same way.
It really is, yeah.
Should I be imagining Jane Grey sitting under a canopy like this?
This is a fairly ornamental but very practical canopy for sun and light rain. They did have a much more homely setup where they had great hoops pulled across, and they'd literally bring out a tapestry or something like a carpet and bring that right the way across, so we'd actually be in the dark here, much more isolated.
Unlike Mary, Jane's life up to this point had not been a public one. Her time had been spent in study and prayer. And as a result, she had become a role model for other Protestant noblewomen.
She's educated to be an example to others. When she's only sort of 14, she's getting letters from adult women saying that they admire her for her learning and holiness. So she's already realises that she's up there on a pedestal.
Jane's power base is starting to look dangerously narrow, pitted against Mary's popularity with the people. And without Northumberland to hold the Privy Council together, cracks are beginning to show.
When Northumberland left the council, he'd created a vacuum, so that there began to be a struggle between those who still supported Northumberland and those who were wavering on the fence and reacted quite negatively to Jane's assertion that she would not make Guildford king.
Jane knows that if the Privy Council begin to waver in their support for her, it will be a catastrophe that will leave her vulnerable and exposed. But for now, alone in the Tower, there are only limited ways in which she can play the part of Queen. She calls for a list to be drawn up of royal jewels and other valuables, which as monarch are now her property. An inventory was made for Jane on the 14th of July, the 5th day of the reign. What was it listing?
It was listing almost 600 items of jewellery that were part of the royal wardrobe at Westminster. So the royal wardrobe was something that supplied everything a monarch could need. It wasn't just clothing and jewellery, it was everything from sort of spices to gunpowder, anything that the king or queen might need. But this is particularly jewellery that you would wear, not the crown jewels, but things like the decoration that would go around a woman's headdress that were jewelled. Things like the gold and silver tips that would go on the laces that would tie, your sleeves to your bodice. And also sort of brooches, crosses.
Why do you think Jane was asking for this list to be made?
I would love to know. I wonder whether she was potentially looking for the types of things she should wear now that were appropriate for her new royal standing. Of course, power dressing. It's incredibly important to the Tudors. And whatever her own feelings might have been about plainer dressing, it was still very important, this conspicuous consumption for the royal family and particularly for the monarch, for the sovereign, to be seen as this glittering person that really was the top of society. And we can see that from the first Protestant coronation of Edward VI, her cousin, that he isn't downplayed. He's wearing things just as luscious and sumptuous as all the previous coronations.
For Jane, the symbols of power, like power itself, would never really be hers. She would not reign long enough for a coronation to take place. On the 15th of July, Northumberland's forces are heading for Cambridge, where he plans to pause and wait for his artillery train and infantry to catch up.
And we think he reaches Cambridge probably by the evening of the 15th. So he is in position up in Cambridge. And you can see quite clearly, I hope now, Helen, that his position there is a strategic position. It's going to take him longer to get to Framlingham, but actually it makes a certain amount of logical military sense.
Because then she's in a stranglehold. His land forces are on one side of her. The ships he sent are at sea on the other side of her. There's really nowhere for her to go.
Exactly. What can go wrong?
Northumberland has Mary surrounded, and although she has a growing army, she can't match his firepower. But it's here that Northumberland has a massive stroke of bad luck.
Well, it's a sequence of very unfortunate events, actually, and the first of them, and we often forget the importance of weather, but the first of them is climatic, in the sense that there was a heavy northeasterly wind driving the royal ships that were actually supposed to be stationed offshore, not actually that close to the coast, they a couple of leagues offshore, which is going to allow them to remain in a blocking position. But the bad weather forces them to take refuge in the Orwell estuary.
As chance would have it, one of Mary's household, Henry Jerningham, is in a local tavern and falls to talking about the naval forces off the coast. Sometime during the evening, he learns that ships laden with soldiers and weaponry are anchored nearby at Orwell Haven. The crews are owed money. Jerningham spots an opportunity. Riding to the harbour, Jerningham finds the ships and succeeds in persuading the unhappy captain and crew to change sides in favour of Mary.
Now, this was a massive coup because, these are ships that have been sent on behalf of Lady Jane, essentially representing the government at that point. Now, in part, they were protesting because of paying conditions, as often is the case, but they were also declaring in support of Mary.
And that mutiny brings her more men, it brings her control of the coast, and it brings her guns.
Yes, all of this is important because her army is growing, and of course, she needs more munitions.
Mary has no cannon at Framlingham. All of a sudden, 5 of the 6 ships are now going to help Mary by unloading their cannon and moving them, dragging them, quite a serious logistical feat, towards Framlingham Castle, where, when they are in position there, they will actually outgun the number of cannon that Northumberland is bringing with him from London. And not only do you get the cannon and their ammunition, but you also get trained gunners. And the Royal Navy at this time is undergoing something of a revolution, but it is one of the finest in the world. And those guns are going to prove very effective in a fight.
The mutiny is one of the key moments that shows that suddenly Mary is not only gaining support rapidly, but actually becoming more than simply a contender and is actually seriously now challenging the claim of Lady Jane, and in a decisive way.
Up until this point, Mary's had support but no artillery. Now she has both. Jane's hold on the throne is looking increasingly vulnerable. On the 16th of July, the devastating news of the mutiny sends shockwaves through the Privy Council. They begin to ask if it's God's punishment for denying Mary her blood right. and the sheer numbers of ordinary people turning to Mary is unnerving even the most ardent supporters of Jane. Then more alarming news reaches the Tower. Local leaders in Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire have declared for Mary and raised a militia against Jane. Without Northumberland, there's no one Jane can trust to take control of the situation.
Well, there's still an opportunity for the royal forces to put them down if the various justices of the peace had acted in accordance with the instructions being sent out from London to make sure that if there's any rising of pro-Mary forces in the country, they are dealt with. And some of them were ignoring, and some of them were supporting Mary. But I think the overall lesson to learn from this is that Northumberland and the members of the Privy Council underestimated the level of latent support, which later became overt support for Mary in the country as a whole.
Jane's House of Cards is beginning to collapse. Mary's no longer trapped in East Anglia, and her support is spreading through the Thames Valley as far as London. London was under threat. The old city had to look to its defences. Orders were given to lock up the Tower and post guards on the city gates. London, a fortified city, was making ready for attack. To see how London became a Tudor fortress, I've come to see the first ever printed map of the city, dating from 1572.
Wow, this is some volume. You get an immediate sense of how the Tower here on the east side role as the defence of the city against shipping coming in from
Absolutely, there it is, at the southeast extent of the city, rather well fortified, and also quite threatening and foreboding. You have here a cell, a cage cell on the waterline, where people could be subjected to the tides, and some spiked heads on sticks.
Oh my goodness, you need good eyes to see those. But yes, so this is a real statement of royal power.
Absolutely, a statement of royal power and foreboding for anybody entering the city.
In terms of the city itself, you can really get a sense of how defensible it might be.
Absolutely, and what's fascinating about that is how that was obviously a concern of the early map makers and the royal family and the leaders.
If you put the Tower together with this city wall that goes right around the city and gates at various points that could be shut.
Absolutely, and indeed a moat.
And the fact that there's only one bridge, of course, means the river is also a
only one
defense.
bridge with gates on the bridge and a wooden section that could be burnt.
Thought of everything.
Yeah.
5 days ago, the city and its tower had been Jane's power base. But now the tables have turned, and she's preparing it against attack. The powerful nobles surrounding Jane are beginning to fear that they have backed the wrong queen, and they're well aware what their fate might be if that proves to be the case. What would a convicted traitor have to look forward to, if that's the right word?
That would depend very much on your social status. If you were a peer of the realm or a female equivalent, you would be executed by beheading, which is a fairly quick, fairly clean death. If you are a commoner, you could be subjected to hanging, drawing and quartering, which is absolutely horrendous. This involves being hanged symbolically, so you're cut down while you're still alive. You are then disemboweled, you're castrated, your entrails and your private parts are burnt in a brazier and a fire on the actual scaffold, and then you're then beheaded and quartered. Your body is cut into 4 quarters, which are exhibited on top of castle gates, and etc. There's a variety of things that can happen to you, none of them very pleasant.
Jane, too, knows from personal experience how quickly fortunes can change with deadly consequences. At the age of 10 or 11, she was sent from her home at Bradgate in Leicestershire to a household in London. Jane was to be the ward of Thomas Seymour and his new wife, Catherine Parr, the widowed queen of Henry VIII. It was a politically advantageous arrangement for the Grey family. Jane had been with the Seymours for a year when Catherine Parr gave birth, and 6 days later died. Jane returned home, but stayed in close contact with her guardian. This is the letter Jane wrote to Thomas Seymour in the autumn of 1548. These my letters shall be to testify unto you that like as you have become towards me a loving and kind father, so I shall be always most ready to obey
your godly monitions and good instructions. 'Tis Jane was about 11 when she wrote this letter. She's writing to someone who's become a father figure to her.
But Seymour was a man of vast ambition, and a few months later his pursuit of power led to his downfall. He was even accused of trying to kidnap the king here at Hampton Court Palace. It was reported that he was caught trying to break into the royal apartments when the king's dog started to bark, and in a panic, Thomas killed it. He was arrested and sent to the Tower. The man who had been Jane's guardian was now sentenced to death as a traitor. The brutal reality of politics at the highest level was a lesson Jane had to learn very young. But even though she knows the risks, there is no going back for Jane. She has worn the crown, she has taken a stand. Now she must see it through. Her last hope lies in keeping the loyalty of the Privy Council. But without Northumberland's reassuring presence, they begin to falter.
In the corridors and the quiet places of the Tower, the men of the Privy Council were unnerved. Sir Edmund Peckham, one of the royal treasurers, had already gone missing.
Jane responds by ordering a strong guard to be mounted around the Tower walls.
If Jane couldn't count on the loyalty of her council, she'd imprison them with her in her fortress.
Jane commanded that they be locked into the Tower and the keys turned over to her personally.
And you get this incredibly poignant sense that the Tower is shifting around Jane, shifting from palace to prison.
She did become a prisoner without knowing it, because these members of the council that were beginning to revolt, if you will, or shift direction, had moved out of the Tower. So she didn't have any direct knowledge of what they were up to.
Jane continues to assert her power, sending out letters to key officials to demand their support. That and her decision to hold the keys to the Tower herself might look like an assertion of power. But in fact, it's a response to an increasingly precarious position. Outside the Tower's walls, there's a growing sense that she's standing in the way of the rightful successor, Mary.
I mean, there really is a sense that more and more people now are supporting Mary. And of course, when you see that there's this real contender, then suddenly it convinces other people to actually throw in their lot with her, because ultimately no one wants to be on the wrong or on the losing side, as it were. So it's not until Mary begins to actually look like she's got a chance that people begin to really throw their lot in with her, and that becomes absolutely crucial.
At this stage, Northumberland's army are still in Cambridge. He's joined by his sons and more troops, but he doesn't yet know that his mission is in grave danger.
So he's now outnumbered probably by as many as 3 to 1, but that itself may not have been enough to deter him from continuing on. But Mary now has artillery, and it's probable that the force of artillery at Framlingham even outmatches his own. And so not only is he outnumbered, he's outgunned.
Over the course of 5 days, Jane's fortunes have changed dramatically. On the 12th, she had the machinery of the Tudor state behind her. By the 16th, her palace is becoming a prison, and Northumberland, her protector, is far from London. Meanwhile, Mary now has a powerful army. She has the support of the people, and the political elite are beginning to join her. Everything now depends on Jane's ability to hold her camp together. But with their allegiances shifting by the day, she's starting to look dangerously isolated. And if she loses this battle for the crown, she'll pay with her life.
Next time, Jane's support is crumbling.
It's like one penny drops, the rest go. It's like dominoes.
A queen becomes a prisoner, and in the end, she's sentenced to death.
Jane had to walk out here, lay her head on the block, and wait for the blade.
But in her last moments, Jane leaves some private messages for posterity.
So this is the book she actually carried onto the scaffold and handed over just before the blindfolding and the kneeling.
Tudors are historical superstars, our most famous royal dynasty. But there is one Tudor monarch who's been all but forgotten: Queen Jane. Lady Jane Grey was a teenager thrust onto the throne, only to lose her crown after just 9 days. She was the first woman to be proclaimed Queen of England, but few would recognise the name Queen Jane. I'm Helen Castor, and over 3 episodes, I'm going to take a forensic look at Jane's story. It's a Tudor thriller, an epic tale of family conflict, ambition, and betrayal. The death of a king covered up, and a country torn between 2 faiths. Our protagonists include the manipulative duke, the wronged princess, and the God-fearing 15-year-old who finds herself caught between them and pays with her life. I'm going to track down original sources written as the drama unfolds.
This is the really exciting bit of the job.
I'll talk to expert colleagues.
I've been in this game for 40 years, and I have to tell you, there is no trickier Tudor subject than Jane Grey.
And I'll visit the places where Jane once walked during the 9 days that she reigned. In this episode, I want to explore just how this teenage girl became queen, and as a result, led England to the brink of civil war. Jane's journey to the throne begins with the sudden illness of the 15-year-old Tudor king, Edward VI, the only son of Henry VIII. If Edward dies childless, his sister Mary will inherit the throne. But she's a woman, and worse, she's a Catholic, an abomination to Edward, who is fiercely Protestant. It's a time bomb that will throw the country into chaos. Catholic or Protestant, the future of the country depends on Edward's survival. As the young king lies on his sickbed at Greenwich Palace, secret dispatches from the imperial ambassador, Jean Scaver, describe the Protestant king's rapid and brutal decline.
The King of England is still confined to his chamber and seems to be sensitive to the slightest indisposition or change. He suffers a good deal when the fever is upon him, especially from a difficulty in drawing his breath.
There may be a lot of gaps in the record, but the king's health was a subject of intense scrutiny. We have every grim detail.
The matter he ejects from his mouth is sometimes coloured a greenish yellow and black. He is beginning to break out in ulcers.
The illness seemed to take hold and progress frighteningly quickly. A procession of the best doctors came and went, but the king was not getting better.
They feel sure that the king has no chance of recovery unless his health improves during the next month.
As the days pass, rumours of the king's illness begin to seep through the court, through the capital, and out into the counties beyond. Stories of the king's illness were played down. But here at Greenwich, in the corridors of power, there was growing concern. People began to speculate about what the death of the king might mean.
That feeling of just terror that the entire world was going to devolve into chaos must have just been enormous for them.
The most powerful nobles in the country know that they stand to lose everything in a Catholic regime. The question of how to hold on to power and keep Mary from the throne preoccupies the key players at court. First among them is the Duke of Northumberland. Northumberland was a soldier, a leader in battle, a politician, principal advisor and confidant to the young king.
During the dissolution of the monasteries, of course, Henry VIII seized all of that property from the Roman Catholic Church and used it as a revenue-generating system and as a reward system.
To what extent was Northumberland personally invested in Protestantism by Edward's reign?
Northumberland was one of those that enriched himself enormously through this system.
In 1553, Northumberland was the power behind the throne. He'd been Henry VIII's Lord Admiral, and now, as head of the Privy Council, he knows that if Edward dies, there's a big problem with the succession. This is the Tudor family tree. Henry VII had 3 surviving children: Margaret, Henry, and Mary. Henry, as the only boy, became king as Henry VIII. And he too had 3 children: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. And Edward was the only boy, so he became king when his father died as Edward VI. But what would happen if Edward died? He had 2 sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, but were there other options elsewhere on the family tree? Margaret had married the King of Scotland, and she'd had a son, but he was already dead, leaving a daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had had 2 daughters, Frances and Eleanor. Frances had 3 daughters, Jane, Catherine, and Mary, and Eleanor had 1, Margaret. So if we look around this family tree, we see that our options are pretty limited. Eleanor was already dead, but otherwise there's Mary, Elizabeth, Frances, Jane, Catherine, Mary, and Margaret. 8 women, not a man in sight.
It was entirely understood that the heir to the throne should be male, full stop. And when you're left with the first 8 heirs to the throne being female, the question wasn't how do we deal with this, it was how do we avoid it?
So in 1553, we're talking about a very live political question. Can a woman rule or not? And you're arguing that Edward's answer is no.
He shared his father's abhorrence of the notion of a woman ruling the realm.
The issue of a woman ruler was only part of the problem. Although Henry VIII had made the break with Rome, it was his son Edward who made sweeping changes to ordinary people's experience of worship. He got rid of candles, images, rosaries, and outlawed the Latin Mass, threatening anyone who stepped out of line with imprisonment. In 1549, religious conflict had erupted into battles between Catholics and Edward's men, as described in Edward's own diary.
The rebels besieged Exeter, where there were many pretty feats of war. They gathered at Launceston, where the Lord Privy Seal went and overthrew them, taking their chiefs and executing them.
But by 1553, one of the greatest champions of Catholicism was Mary, Henry VIII's eldest child and the heir to Edward's throne. Aged 37, Mary was an unrepentant Catholic. Before her brother's illness, she had held regular illegal masses at her home. This act of defiance enraged Edward and hardened his resolve that she should never be queen. The fact that the heir to the throne was Catholic was a frightening prospect, not only for Edward, but for the Duke of Northumberland. Next in line was Henry's 19-year-old daughter Elizabeth. And although she was Protestant, like Mary, she was technically illegitimate. But as Edward's illness progresses, a secret document is hastily produced in his sick room. What was Edward planning, and why?
This is Edward's device for the succession. It's in his own handwriting, which was never the most beautiful handwriting in the world, but it's looking scrappier than it had been, perhaps because he was already becoming ill. It's clearly a document written by a teenage boy. The handwriting isn't very sophisticated, and neither actually is the language. My device for the succession, it says at the top. And the essence of Edward's plan is clear in the first paragraph, where one word gets repeated over and over again. Male, 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 heirs male. The problem Edward has is that there aren't any. He's having to talk about possible heirs male who might be born in the future. Obviously, he hopes he'll have a son of his own, but just in case, he's decided on a particular female line through which the crown should pass. And that's where we come to Jane Grey. She isn't the first name on the list, that's her mother, Frances. For lack of issue of my body, to the Lady Frances's heirs male. But Lady Frances Grey only had daughters. So then after her, for lack of such issue before my death, to the Lady Jane's heirs male, and then on to her sisters, to the Lady Catherine's heirs male, to the Lady Mary's heirs male. Edward then goes on to an elaborate plan about what should happen if those baby boys haven't been born by the time he dies. But the basic principle is clear. Edward wants a Protestant king to rule after his death. There are still questions. It's Edward's handwriting, but we don't know if it was Edward's idea, whether he was under pressure or whether this was exactly what he wanted.
As leader of the Privy Council, the Duke of Northumberland was Edward's closest advisor. There's a possibility that he had a hand in this document for his own very personal reasons. The Grey family has now become the focus of Edward's plans for the succession. The device names Jane, Catherine and Mary Grey and their mother Frances. Until one of them produces a son, Francis would be a caretaker and the throne of England would remain empty.
So if he died, the throne was going to be empty. Francis was going to be governor, working with the Privy Council. Big problem, terrifying. You've got out there, you've got the sharks out there of Charles V, the King of France. They might want to put their own candidates on the throne.
So what's the solution to the difficulty of that empty chair?
Well, I think their immediate solution is to have a round of marriages in the hope that someone will produce a son before Edward dies. Basically, everyone of royal blood is married off. Catherine, who's only 12, who's going to be married to the son of the Earl of Pembroke. His son, who's only, I think, 15, is taken from his sickbed to be married, as a bright green in the face. Then you have little Mary Grey, who's 8 years old and undersized, and she is betrothed to a middle-aged man, Lord Grey of Wilton, who's one of the great warriors of the time, hideously disfigured by a sort of pike that had been thrust through his face.
Of all the royal descendants, the greatest prize is the eldest of the Grey sisters, 15-year-old Jane. Growing up in Leicestershire, Jane Grey's early life gave no indication of what was to come. Aged around 11, she moved to London to live under the wardship of the King's uncle, Thomas Seymour. It was here that she advanced her education with the best Protestant tutors the country had to offer.
Jane's education is special. She's educated to a greater degree even than someone like Princess Mary or Princess Elizabeth, largely because she has no brothers. So she becomes the sole recipient, I suppose, of the family resources as well as the family ambition.
She is receiving a humanist education. So she knows Latin, Greek, Hebrew. She's also learning Italian. She's really, in some ways, being seen as the future of the Protestant Reformation in England.
Jane's education was facilitated by her father, Henry Grey, who was a senior nobleman and a member of the Privy Council. He was close to Northumberland, And together they agreed a plan for the marriage of Jane to Northumberland's son Guildford, who was also about 15 years old. For Northumberland, Jane was his route to the power of the crown through his son. He arranged their wedding at one of his lavish London residences, Durham House on the banks of the Thames. It was just over there. Today, it's Victoria Embankment Gardens just across from the South Bank. But in the 16th century, this was one of the most upmarket addresses in London. Edward was confined to his sickbed and unable to attend the marriage, but a royal warrant was issued, providing extravagant clothes for the wedding party.
Jane was really quite reluctant to enter this marriage, I think. I think you can document that in the sources. She agreed to do it because her parents sort of pushed her into it.
In Richard Davies' 1909 book, The 9 Days Queen, we have the following passage. Her parents ordered her to marry the young gentleman, and according to an Italian chronicler, she at first stoutly refused. The Duke harshly reiterated his command, and according to the chronicler, even struck his daughter several hard blows. Whether or not there was violence, Jane was certainly put under pressure to be married, and with good reason. The king's health was failing. As the weeks tick past and Jane embarks on married life, Edward shows no sign of recovery. The realization dawns that there's no prospect of any male heirs being born in time. We don't know the date or the precise details, but sometime in the weeks before his death, a final and critical change is made to the device. It's a change that will have a devastating impact on the life of Lady Jane Grey. Two small words have been added in Edward's own handwriting. Two words that would change the course of England's history. And her. Before, it said, the Lady Jane's heirs male. Now, after this change, it says, the Lady Jane and her heirs male.
They were suddenly faced with the fact that a woman simply was going to have to inherit the throne, whether any of them liked it or not. And the only woman available for that at that moment was Jane Grey.
You also have to remember, I'm really sorry to have to say this in the 21st century, but, you know, she's a woman, and she's a young woman. And in the 16th century, there were no equal opportunities.
Women were considered to be creatures of emotion rather than of reason.
It was considered that a woman couldn't hold the throne of England.
So this decision to make Jane queen was absolutely transformational. It was about to propel her from being a minor member of the royal family to the English throne, and she knew nothing about it. The device is an incendiary document. Northumberland knows that once Edward's sister Mary discovers that she's been cut out of the succession, it could start a civil war. For now, he needs to keep the device under wraps. So he bides his time and gathers a tight-knit group of counsellors around him. Mary, Jane's rival for the throne, had been growing increasingly suspicious that all was not well at court. Just a few days before Edward's death, Northumberland had tried to lure her to London.
She gets a tip-off from someone at court, a warning that Edward is dying, and the summons to court that she's received shouldn't be followed, that she shouldn't go back to court, she shouldn't respond to it, because there is a plan to capture her when she comes to court on the pretense of coming to see her dying brother.
Fearing that Northumberland will try to capture or even kill her, Mary goes into hiding.
She's got to get ahead. She's got to get some miles between her and Northumberland because, of course, you know, she's been summoned to court and she hasn't gone to court. You know, the assumption is, therefore, that Northumberland or someone will come out and get her.
On the 6th of July, at about 8 p.m, the 15-year-old king says he feels faint. A few minutes later, he dies. For Northumberland, the game is on. He needs to consolidate his position and place Jane, now his daughter-in-law, on the throne before Mary finds out.
Immediately, the council sprung into action to do what needed to be done to effect a new reign. Just rapid, furious movement, I'm sure, as people began to consolidate and solidify positions and get everyone into place.
That night, there's no announcement that the king is dead, nor the next day. The public don't know. Not even Jane is aware of her new role as Queen of England. At first light, Northumberland sends his son Robert and 300 soldiers to catch Mary before she has time to gather support. Mary's been in hiding with Catholic supporters, and that same day, word reaches her that her brother is dead. Robert Raines, a London goldsmith who'd worked for Mary, heard the story that the king was dead and immediately fled the city, riding 80 miles at breakneck speed to Mary in Norfolk. He did so to make sure she'd heard the news. With Mary in hiding, Northumberland and his supporters in the Privy Council turn their attention to securing the greatest fortress in England, the Tower of London. Like the rest of the court, the Privy Council have been here in Greenwich for the last few weeks, at the bedside of the dying king. Suddenly, they're packing their things and clambering into the royal barges over there at the water's edge. They disappear that way, upriver, to London. It takes 45 minutes to get from Greenwich to the Tower by royal boat if you're rowing with the tide. In the 16th century, to hold the Tower was to hold power. The council came to occupy the Tower, and just as importantly, to ensure that Mary could not. The Tower of London was founded in 1066 following the Norman conquest. It was one of the strongest, most imposing castles of the Middle Ages. It was a royal residence, a jail for the most prized prisoners, and the state armory, containing huge stores of munitions and gunpowder. The tower was feared and looked on with awe. People believed that whoever controlled the tower controlled the country. Northumberland knew it was vital to strengthen the battlements to defend the tower from attack. Great guns were to be placed in the White Tower and additional troops drafted in to man the perimeter walls. They were preparing to put their candidate, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne and bracing themselves against a potential counterattack from Mary. Throughout the 8th of July, Northumberland quietly moves reinforcements loyal to his cause across the country. Key offices of state are hastily secured for his allies.
Behind the scenes, ships were sent north to protect the coast, to prevent Mary from fleeing overseas. There were changes in many of the fortresses in and around London where people who had been in office in those fortresses were removed because they were known not to support the plan. And new people were installed that had vested financial interest in supporting this plan.
In the 48 hours since Edward's death, Northumberland has succeeded in carrying out the first phase of the Protestant plan. He holds the tower, the weapons, and crucially, he has the dead king's device for the succession, naming his daughter-in-law as queen. But the frenzied activity and movement of guards has not gone unnoticed. By the time the sun set on Saturday, the 8th of July, 1553, almost all the key political players in London and beyond knew that Edward was dead and that Jane would be queen, though no public statement had been made. The one person of note who didn't yet know was Jane.
And I believe that action in and of itself is a clear indication of how Northumberland and the Privy Council viewed Jane. She was effectively a cipher. They intended to control her in some manner from the get-go. She was to be a figurehead, and she was, as a woman, inconsequential.
By the 9th of July, Edward has been dead for 3 days. Northumberland is ready for phase 2 of his plan. It's time for the Privy Council to seize the moment and their new queen, Jane Grey. Publicly, nobody considers Jane to be particularly important. Publicly, nobody knows that the order of succession has been changed, and that includes Jane. Early on the 9th, Northumberland sends for Jane, but she has no idea why. He instructs that she should be brought immediately, by river, to his house at Sion, if necessary, by force. Today's professional rivermen move quicker than their Tudor forebears.
Hello.
Hiya.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Helen.
Hello, Helen. London VTS says it's swim safety run.
But the idea is the same. We live in an age of instant information and instant communication. It's a blessing and a curse. Not so Jane. With a team of oarsmen, Jane's journey to Sion took more than an hour and a half. She was completely in the dark about why she'd been summoned, and could never have imagined what lay in store. This is where Jane arrives, Sion House. Today, the front of the house is on the other side, but in the 16th century, it was here, the side accessible from the river. Sion House in 1553 was home to the Duke of Northumberland and remains so to this day. It's still recognisable as the house where Jane arrived on the 9th of July. The story goes that this is the room, the long gallery, where Jane heard that she was to be queen.
So on the 9th, Jane is sent for, and in fact, she is brought here, into this very place at Sion. She is told that now she is going to be queen. And the French ambassador reports what she said. This is not for me. The rightful heir is Mary.
The traditional story has it that she burst into tears and didn't want to be queen. She expressed a desire not to be queen. But if you look at her own account that she conveyed to Queen Mary some weeks after the event, she does describe bursting into tears. But it's very clear if you read it closely that those tears were for the death of Edward VI. They weren't for the circumstance she was in.
Northumberland gave her a lecture on the illegitimacy of Mary and the illegitimacy of Elizabeth. And then Jane's parents arrived. Parental pressure that pushed her over.
She prayed to God to give her the strength to do the job that had been given to her, which indicates to me that she was somewhat accepting, albeit reluctantly, that this was the role God had chosen for her, so she had to make the best of it.
Bolstered by her faith, Jane accepts the crown that afternoon. The die is cast. That evening, Northumberland throws an opulent banquet. It's a celebration of Jane's accession as queen. But he's also demonstrating to his supporters that they're right to be backing him. This was a grand alliance they should be proud to be part of. For Jane, the 9th of July marks the day she prepares to become the first Queen of England. For Mary, the 9th of July marks the beginning of her fight for the throne. Having outrun Northumberland's men for the moment, she's now arrived at her seat in Kenninghall. Initially, the pen is mightier than the sword. She writes to harness support around the country. We came here to the Inner Temple Library to see Edward VI's device for the succession, but the archivist has brought me something else to look at, which I haven't seen before, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's written on the 9th of July at her manor of Kenninghall in Norfolk. Now, the 9th of July is the day when Jane was taken to Sion House to be told that she would be the next queen. But that's clearly a course of events that Mary was not prepared to accept, because Mary has signed this letter, Mary the Queen, by the Queen, it says at the top. The 9th of July is Sunday. Edward had died on the night of Thursday the 6th. So Mary has moved into action with enormous courage and enormous speed. She asserts that she is now Queen by Act of Parliament and the testament and last will of our late dearest father, King Henry VIII. There can be no question in Mary's mind that she is the lawful sovereign. The letter is addressed to Sir Edward Hastings, an influential landowner. She's asking Hastings to protect her and her realm by raising forces within the county of Middlesex. And the particularly interesting thing looking at this letter is that it looks to me very much as though a gap has been left and Middlesex added later. In other words, that this was a form document. Clerks were writing out the same letter again and again to be sent to different places, and this one happened to go to Sir Edward Hastings. Mary's machinery of support is moving into action. But would Mary have any chance against Northumberland and the power of the state?
The prospects of Mary winning were so slim. She's a woman with a household in East Anglia that's full of local, yokel Catholic gentrymen, nobody who's got any political experience. And so, everything is under the control of the Duke of Northumberland. So no one rates Mary's chances whatsoever.
10th of July. As the day dawns, the Tower is now secure for the Protestant cause. Northumberland's plan is going well, and he decides it's time to break the news to the people. It's time for Jane to make her first public appearance as England's Queen. And the very next day, after being told that she was the new Queen, Jane was heading for the Tower. We're still well outside the City of London, the city walls proper as they were in the 16th century. So on Jane's journey, there were fields still to north and south. Now it's surrounded by buildings, glass and steel. but in the 16th century it was the most imposing building for miles around. From further down the river, it looks a bit as though the tower might be dwarfed by office blocks. But actually, when you get up close, it still has an authority. It's a strange idea. A young woman making this exact journey, with one life left behind her in Chelsea and another up ahead. And though she doesn't realise it yet, there's no going back down this river. No going back to her old home, her old title, her old friends, her old life. For Jane, everything changes at the end of this river journey. Jane's entrance to the tower is full of pomp and ceremony. It's a moment of pure propaganda. But almost immediately, the first stirrings of disquiet begin to spread among the assembled crowd. We know this thanks to 2 letters that came to light in 2013, believed to be written by a Venetian diplomat.
They were written by someone who was present in London, who was seeing these events going on, was writing home saying, this is what's happening here, here's the news.
The letters describe Queen Jane being accompanied into the tower by her mother, Frances Grey. And among the ladies, the mother, who as greatest in precedence held the train of the gown. Now you say to me that this seems to you a monstrosity, to see a child queen and mother living, to speak with her and to serve her on bended knee. Frances Grey had a better claim to the throne than her daughter, but of course she wasn't married to Northumberland's son.
The reason people were shocked, of course, was because that she was the mother. She was superior in line of succession, so why is she carrying her daughter's train? And this was incredibly shocking to people at the time because of the whole way they saw their world and indeed the universe, because they believed that God had created the universe from chaos, that he had created a harmonious universe in which everything had its place in a sort of great chain of being. Everyone is a part of this chain, and who rebels against it? Satan rebels against it. Satan rebels against it. He wants to bring chaos, civil war, horror back to the earth and for the whole universe to return to darkness and chaos. So this small business of Frances carrying her daughter's train is, in a sense, opening the gates to hell.
And unease was further stirred by the unusual prominence in the procession of Northumberland's son, Jane's new husband, a teenage boy with no claim to the throne at all. The husband stood with hat in hand, not only in front of the Queen, but in front of father and mother, all the other lords making a show of themselves, putting the knee on the ground.
We see Guildford in a whole different light in these letters. He assumes a position of prominence, even physically, to the extent that he's at the front of the procession, in front of his parents, and in front of Jane, which tells us that he was intended from the get-go to be king through her.
And that idea was spreading fast. After receiving news of Edward's death, the French ambassador wrote home referring to le nouveau roi, the new king. Do you think part of the plan for this marriage was that if Jane becomes queen, then Guildford Dudley becomes king?
Oh, absolutely.
There had never, ever been a king come to the throne in right of his wife. We speak quite often of people taking titles, lower titles of nobility in right of their wife, but not the crown. That is the ultimate title. And I think the ultimate goal was to make Guildford king.
The recently discovered letters say the people whispered against Northumberland that one had poisoned the king. And because the Duke saw it was not possible to seize the crown of England himself, for that reason he designed to seize it by surprise, by means of a relative. Northumberland had so much to gain from pulling off this coup. As Edward's chief minister, he had been close to royal power, but this was his chance to take the crown for his own family. Was Northumberland behind the change to Edward's device? We'll never know for sure, but what's certain is that he was a hated figure.
Northumberland, remember, is very unpopular in the country. Why? Because he's the guy who put down the popular revolts of 1549 using German and Genoese mercenaries.
Yes, he put down the rebellion, and he did so rather savagely. And that earned him a great deal of hatred from the people.
On the 10th of July, Northumberland knew he had to convince the people that Jane was the right and true queen. So his council does something unprecedented in English history. They order multiple copies of her proclamation to the throne to be printed and distributed. It was the first time that a new monarch was announced in print. And it exists to this day, here at the Society of Antiquaries.
This is a volume of royal proclamations. And what I've got here is the proclamation of the accession of King Edward VI back in 1547. It's a straightforward example of its kind. It's handwritten, it's short, it's the text of what the heralds said on the streets of London when they explained that Edward was now king. Henry VIII has died, Edward, his son, is inherited, and Edward promises to rule well. Everyone must be loyal to him. Job done. But this isn't what I've come to see. Further on in the volume, there's a copy of the proclamation of the accession of Queen Jane Grey. Here it is. And what I can see straight away is that it's something very different. It goes on for 3 pages. There's a lot to explain. There's nothing straightforward about this. Jane is now, it says, by the grace of God, Queen of England. But the first thing it has to do is explain what the arrangements for the succession were. That means going back to Henry's will, to explaining that he left the throne to Mary and Elizabeth. But then the proclamation goes on to show that they were illegitimate and Edward had made different arrangements. By this stage, we're over the page. The proclamation explains the whole of Edward's device for the succession. It's a complicated business. And it's not until the bottom of page 2, the beginning of page 3, that we learn that Jane will rule and all her subjects must obey her. This took a long time for the heralds to read out, on streets that were silent, full of puzzled people trying to work out what was going on. And the other difference is that this proclamation is printed, and that's because the presses had to work overnight to get multiple copies of all this information out so that they could be pasted up around the streets of the city. A new regime was in place, and it was a shock. Seeing an original copy of that proclamation was amazing. It looked like it could have been printed yesterday. And the sheer size of it gives a real sense of how big a problem Jane was facing.
It was against the right order of things. It was against the natural order. And if it was against right order and the natural order, then what lay beyond that? Chaos, anarchy, violence, horror. Just as she enters the tower, and that sort of terrible image one has of the sort of doors of the tower closing, and they will never open again for Jane.
An account by an Italian resident in London said that when the proclamation was read, not one showed any expression of joy, rather than the celebrations that usually greeted a new monarch. Dissent came at a price. One person spoke out against Queen Jane.
His name was Gilbert Pott, and he was promptly arrested. He was put on the pillory, his ears were nailed to the pillory, and to be released from the pillory, he had to suffer to have his ears cut off.
This first-hand account comes from the diary of the merchant Henry Matchin.
that's the sort of thing that could happen to you if you just so much as said, Jane doesn't have the rightful claim.
Much better to keep quiet.
Much better. Much safer.
Northumberland believes his plan is working. The capital is under his control, and Jane is in full command of the Tower of London. She's surrounded by the Privy Council. They have authority over the realm, they have control of the country's finances, and an arsenal of weapons at their disposal. But then, sometime on the 10th, Jane's first day as Queen, a dispatch arrives at the Tower from Princess Mary. Mary's letter calls upon the council to display their loyalty to her just and right cause. It declares her ready to pardon them, but if they didn't surrender, they would face bloodshed and civil war.
And of course, this is a sense that this is the moment that I've been waiting for. This is what my life has been all about. I'm ready to claim the throne. This is the moment where I'm going to restore England back to Rome, which of course is what God wants. So, it couldn't be a bigger moment for Mary.
For Northumberland and the council, the stakes had just been raised. They'd been offered a pardon if they abandoned Jane, or the threat of civil war if they didn't. And the personal consequences of that warning for each of them were clear. The loss of titles and wealth, imprisonment, perhaps execution. By the evening of the 10th, it's do or die for Jane's supporters. If they're having doubts, now is the moment to turn back. But they don't. Instead, they draft a letter in response to Mary's challenge for Jane to sign. The first that will carry her signature as Jane the Queen. A signature that, in a few days' time, would be held as evidence of treason. When was this letter written, and who was it written to?
So it was written on the 10th of July, 1553, on the day that Jane entered the Tower of London as Queen of England. And at the top of the letter, we can see it's been signed by Jane as Jane the Queen.
And we know this is her handwriting?
This is definitely her hand, yes. And it was one of a number of letters that were sent out to the Lord's Lieutenant of the country. This one in particular was sent to William Parr, who was the Marquess of Northampton. So the letter announces that Jane has entered into our rightful possession of this kingdom. And then the local officers or the Lord's Lieutenant were called upon to defend our just title, but also to assist us in our rightful possession of this kingdom and to disturb, repel and resist the feigned and untrue claim of the Lady Mary, bastard daughter, to our great uncle, Henry VIII of famous memory.
So this isn't a normal part of an accession. A normal king or queen would expect the machinery of government to fall into place, but Jane's having to protest a little bit too much because she's facing a challenge from her rival, Mary.
Yes, and by this stage they would have been very aware that Mary was gathering forces and preparing to fight back.
And there's a note that's been added here to the letter that says, in Latin, Jane, not Queen. Do we know where that came from?
It's in a later hand, so it's almost as if somebody's wanted to correct the record and point out that Jane wasn't actually Queen.
Despite having signed the letter with such confidence at the top, Jane the Queen, the correction here says history says otherwise.
Yep.
These letters stand as proof of the enormous tensions of day one of Jane's reign. They are a clear response to Mary's threat. Jane's first day as the first Queen of England is drawing to a close, and there's been a dramatic change in her. Just one day earlier, when told that she was to be Queen, Jane was very reluctant to accept the role. Now she's asking for reinforcements, for military might to defend her claim. Now Jane is prepared to go to war. If Mary believes she has a right to the throne, she'll have to take it by force. As day breaks on the 11th, Northumberland sends recruiting parties out onto the streets to build up a force to suppress Mary's rebellion.
They didn't have standing armies. They didn't have any of the security mechanisms that we like to think we have today. So that if an unexpected event came up, it was chaos. You never knew which way things were going to go.
They relied on the nobility, the gentry, and ultimately ordinary people to support them. They were just one man, or in the case of Jane, one woman, and you needed people to want to back you and support you and fight for you. You couldn't sort of force them to.
It's telling that Northumberland has to offer almost twice the usual daily rate to recruit an army.
Well, even then, to muster an army within London, he had to offer an outrageously high pay rate that was so outrageous that everyone felt the need to record it. Oh my God, he's paying this much per day. That's so out of the ordinary. So it's clear that the only thing that was getting people to muster to Northumberland was money.
Mary has also put out a call to arms.
She's mobilising an army ready to fight, and I think that's really important. I mean, she's not cowering away here. She is ready to assert her claim to the throne. But this is dangerous at this point. She cannot be sure who to trust, and she doesn't quite know, of course, either where, the Duke of Northumberland or any of his henchmen are, and that's the great fear at this moment.
Meanwhile, in the Tower of London, Jane continues to send out letters rallying key supporters throughout the realm. She's growing in confidence as the days pass.
She's always cast as the very innocent, very pious, sort of demure, submissive puppet of the men around her.
Jane was a much more interesting individual than that. She had strong views.
As a child, she was surrounded by influential figures who were tough, uncompromising, and not afraid to voice their own opinion. What might be surprising is how many of them were women.
She was exposed not only to Catherine Parr, who was a very assertive woman and would argue religion with her husband, the king, and very nearly lost her own life for doing so. But at the same time, she was exposed to other very strong-willed, highly educated women like Mildred Cecil, the wife of William Cecil, who would go on to become Elizabeth's chief minister. She was exposed to Catherine Willoughby, the last wife of Charles Brandon, who was herself a very assertive, competent, educated woman. Jane witnessed all this growing up, she absorbed it, and she was able to project that back out once she was in a position to assert her own authority.
Perhaps she wasn't the puppet history paints her as. So the idea that she would simply roll over and do whatever her husband and her father-in-law and her father told her seems to have been a miscalculation from the beginning.
Mary was a strong and assertive woman. Elizabeth was a strong and assertive woman. And we're asked to believe that their cousin, Jane, would somehow suddenly be submissive? No, she was part of that Tudor dynamic, and she knew how to put herself forward, she knew how to violate norms, and she knew how to do that in a relatively acceptable way. And she did it with the crown.
Jane does something that Northumberland could never have predicted. Jane was alone when the crown was brought to her. According to Girolamo Pollini, an Italian friar, the Lord Treasurer said he just wanted her to put it on to see how it suited her. Then the Lord Treasurer said a new one would be made for Guildford,
A king, after all, needed a crown. Jane thought for a moment. Then she said no. She would make her husband a duke, but not a king.
Given Northumberland's plans, this was an extraordinary act of independence.
When Guildford heard her decision, he tried to argue, but there was no changing her mind. Jane was queen, and she would rule alone.
She says, well, you can forget that for a game of soldiers. The most I'm going to do for you is make you a duke. To which Guildford Dudley replies, if that's the case, no king, no sex. No sex, no successor. And he has to be sort of appeased and sort of carted off by the Earls of Arundel and Pembroke.
This is the moment we see Jane take control. If the plan was to install a king by default, Jane wasn't having it. The men had made their plans. They'd tried to control the crown, the country, Mary, and Jane. And she said no. This was her moment.
I think that was absolutely the critical turning point in the entire succession crisis. I think had she agreed to make him king outright, had she acquiesced and been the submissive, docile puppet that they wanted, things might have gone a little differently.
She was the sort of person we might recognize today. She's a sort of teenage religious ideologue who's prepared to die for her religious cause.
For Jane, everything has changed. The carefree life of a privileged young girl from Leicestershire has been swept aside by a plot to make her queen. In 2 days, Jane has occupied the throne and the role entirely. Her transformation is complete. Her rule has begun. But Northumberland and the Privy Council's plans are unravelling. Their assumption that Jane would bend to their bidding was mistaken. Their belief that Guildford would become king was wrong. And their certainty that Mary would simply go quietly was the biggest miscalculation of all. In a country that had never had a ruling queen, this was now a battle between two women, both determined to fight for the throne, both believing that this was their time. Next time, Northumberland's iron grip on power begins to slip.
He wasn't expecting Mary to go to battle, and that was Northumberland's biggest mistake.
Against the odds, Mary's support is growing.
We see that the impossible gradually becomes possible.
And Jane finds herself under threat from the rebels.
With that artillery, she could have blown a hole in the side of the tower.
Those that end up on the losing side will pay with their lives. Tudors are historical superstars, our most famous royal dynasty. But there is one Tudor monarch who's been all but forgotten: Queen Jane. Lady Jane Grey was a teenager thrust onto the throne, only to lose her crown after just 9 days. She was the first woman to be proclaimed Queen of England, but few would recognize the name Queen Jane. I'm Helen Castor, and over 3 episodes, I'm going to take a forensic look at Jane's story. It's a Tudor thriller, an epic tale of family conflict, ambition, and betrayal. The death of a king covered up, and a country torn between two faiths. Our protagonists include the manipulative Duke, the wronged princess, and the God-fearing 15-year-old who finds herself caught between them and pays with her life. I'm going to track down original sources written as the drama unfolds.
This is the really exciting bit of the job.
I'll talk to expert colleagues.
I've been in this game for 40 years, and I have to tell you, there is no trickier Tudor subject than Jane Grey.
And I'll visit the places where Jane once walked during the 9 days that she reigned. This time, Jane's power base dissolves into deceit and treachery. But the question remains, will she escape with her life, or will she pay the ultimate price for her part in the coup? Jane Grey wakes on the morning of the 17th of July, 1553, 8 days into her reign. She has taken personal charge of the keys to the Tower of London. She's locked her own supporters inside the tower with her. Many believe that the end is approaching. We're entering the final chapter of a story that began several months earlier. The men who surrounded the dying son of Henry VIII have staged a coup. They've blocked Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter, from the succession and put her cousin Jane onto the throne. Lady Jane Grey was a teenager in the royal court. Now she's Queen Jane of England. But Mary has fought back, and she's proving popular. Out in East Anglia, at her castle at Framlingham, Mary has assembled an army of local landowners and tenant farmers.
It becomes apparent that the common mood of the realm is pro-Marian.
Noblemen discovered that their tenants were refusing to fight for them. And just as a king needed his nobles to fight for him, nobles needed their tenants to fight for them. That's how it all worked.
Even some of Jane's closest advisors, men from her Privy Council, have been talking of abandoning her.
Jane learned of this and commanded that they be locked into the tower and the keys turned over to her personally. Very assertive move on her part.
2 days ago, Mary was the underdog, but now the tables have turned. Jane's navy has mutinied, giving their precious gunpowder and artillery to Mary.
This was a massive coup because, you know, these are ships that have been sent on behalf of Lady Jane, essentially representing the government at that point, and they've declared for the rank outsider, as it were, Mary.
Mary has the numbers and the artillery. For the first time, Jane is under threat. And now it's not just her crown she could lose, it's her life. As members of the council begin to desert her, Jane is taking extraordinary precautions in an extraordinary situation.
I think once the Privy Council had begun to entertain the option of leaving the tower and Jane had to actually physically lock them in, I think she was intelligent enough to know that she was in trouble. She was in serious trouble.
The same morning as Jane wakes in the tower, the Duke of Northumberland rises in Cambridge, where he's camped at the head of his army. The Duke of Northumberland was no ordinary military leader. He was a powerful politician. He'd been chief advisor to Edward VI and the dominant figure at the royal court. He was also a leader in the battle against Catholicism.
It was quite dramatic, so they were tearing organs out of churches because they didn't believe in music in church, and as well as destroying stained glass. I think something like 90% of religious art was destroyed.
And while he'd become very powerful, he's also extremely unpopular. Having succeeded in putting Jane onto the throne, Northumberland now has another job to do in East Anglia.
The key element in a succession crisis like this is to get hold of the alternative monarch.
Northumberland wants to capture Mary and prevent her from moving against Jane's regime. The plan is to engage with Mary's forces at her castle in Framlingham. But Northumberland's progress has been slow. Northumberland had arrived in Cambridge on the 15th. Here, 50 miles from Framlingham, he hesitated. Rather than move in for a quick battle, he chose to wait for reinforcements. After 2 days of waiting, there's good news.
On the 17th, he's still at Cambridge. He's waiting for his reinforcements to come in, and they are coming in. Probably the artillery arrives on the 17th, which is the key weapon for him. He knows that Mary's at Framlingham. He's assuming she's going to be entrenched there to try and defend the position. That is exactly what she was intending to do, and therefore he's going to need artillery to reduce her position. So he gets this key force on the 17th, and therefore is now ready to move. He's probably about 3,000 strong now, 2,000 cavalry, 1,000 infantry, and then, of course, these 30 or so artillery pieces.
What he doesn't know is that a major piece of his plan, the warships off the coast of Suffolk, have mutinied. Now, at Framlingham, Mary has the artillery she was lacking. He's outgunned, but he doesn't know it yet. News of the mutiny has reached the Privy Council in London, and they haven't told Northumberland. Some of them are questioning their loyalty to Jane.
The imperial ambassadors reported that many good men, among whom there are members of the council, are disgusted. They added, "There's trouble coming."
Not knowing what's going on in London, Northumberland begins to position his men, ready for battle against Mary.
He begins to move, finally, towards Framlingham, pretty much due east on the morning of the 18th. The force breaks down probably 2-1 in terms of cavalry, but cavalry were the most dominant force on the battlefield at that time anyway, so that was a good thing. It's not a massive army, but these are pretty reliable soldiers, probably better trained in his mind than anything that Mary will have to tackle him with, and therefore it's enough for the job.
Inside the fortress of the Tower of London, the Privy Council is receiving a steady stream of worrying reports, including one message with chilling implications.
Sir Edmund Peckham, Treasurer of the Mint, is missing. No one knows for sure where he is, but rumours are flying. Reports say that he's helped assemble forces from Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, and Middlesex. And they're not for Jane, but for Mary.
If the rumours are true, Peckham has mustered 10,000 men, and they're ready to march on London to depose Jane. She immediately begins writing to powerful landowners for help.
This is a letter written on the 18th of July, 1553, from the Tower by Jane the Queen, as it says at the top. And it's a letter asking for help in subduing the violence and resistance that's taking place in her kingdom. And it asks the recipients to assemble, muster, and levy all the power you can possibly make to repair with all possible speed towards Buckinghamshire, for the repressing and subduing of certain tumults and rebellions moved there against us and our crown by certain seditious men. This is a last-ditch attempt by Jane to rally support behind her.
But these desperate letters come too late.
In one report from the imperial ambassadors, they suggest that Mary appears to be stronger than the Duke. The balance, it seems, has tipped.
Now the odds are that the Duke is facing defeat at Mary's hands, a message is hurriedly dispatched from the Tower. The Duke is poised for the last push to Framlingham, when the letter arrives.
He receives information that actually everything's changed, and two bits of crucial information. The first bit is that Mary's forces are actually stronger than he might have anticipated. So he's outnumbered by 3-1, but the really key bit of information he gets is that Mary now has artillery, and she's got artillery from the royal ships that have mutinied and joined her. And so not only is he outnumbered, he's outgunned. And it's at this point that he makes what we can say in retrospect was the fatal decision to withdraw back to Cambridge.
But Northumberland has one last hope. He's expecting the Privy Council to put down the rising in Mary's favour to the west of London.
What he doesn't know is that things have been changing in the Tower. One by one, Jane's loyal circle have begun to abandon her. Her control over the Tower is slipping, and members of the Privy Council are disappearing by the hour.
And one of those who quietly slips away is the man Jane was depending on to lead the reinforcements against Mary's supporters. Her own uncle, the Earl of Arundel.
It always seems to me very poignant that Jane is left in the Tower with the other Privy Councillors around her, and one by one they start dropping like flies.
Once the one drops, it's like one penny drops, the rest go. It's like dominoes. Because they begin to see that the public mood is very much against Jane. It's very much in favor of Mary.
Finally abandoned by her uncle and the other members of the Privy Council, time has run out for Queen Jane. The 18th of July would be the last day of Jane's 9-day reign. By the morning of the 19th of July, only those closest to Jane remain with her in the Tower of London, including her husband, Guildford Dudley, and her father, Henry Grey, who stays with his daughter to the end. The Privy Council are now free from the confines of the Tower. They've been quick to abandon Jane in her hour of need.
These members of the council were a mix. You have both Protestants and Catholics. You have the Earl of Arundel, who was a Catholic, and he had supported Jane, but we presume that that was for monetary reasons, but then he fell back on his religious alliance and shifted to Mary. Paulette, he was an older man who had been raised in the Catholic faith, had converted to Protestantism, so he too began to shift back. And the Earl of Huntingdon did so as well, but if Huntingdon were to support Queen Mary, that could give him a leg up in his own home power base.
They now risked being seen as traitors by both rival queens. A crisis meeting was called at Baynard's Castle on the banks of the Thames. The council gathered, and Arundel put together an argument that might just absolve them of blame.
Arundel makes the case for the innocence of the assembled men. And the man they make the scapegoat is the one man who isn't there.
It was time to speak against the Duke of Northumberland.
Arundel's words have been reported many times, and every report differs. But one version from the papal envoy Commendone has him describing the Duke as a man unhampered by scruples.
He addressed the Privy Council, saying, "My conscience was burdened with remorse, considering how the rights of my Lady Mary, true heir to this crown, were usurped, and that we have been robbed of that liberty which we have enjoyed so long under the rule of our legitimate kings. I believe that you know well enough the ways and means that the Duke is using, and that he is not moved either by zeal of the public welfare, nor of the religion, but only by the ambition to rule."
The Privy Council has a choice to make. They need to survive with their lives and fortunes intact.
The Privy Council came to their conclusion. The true queen was Mary. It's a decisive moment. Decisive for the future of the Privy Council, decisive for the country, decisive for Jane. The council had put Jane on the throne, and now they abandon her and declare for Mary. For the council, the most important thing is to get the news to Mary and secure their futures as best they can. As the Earl of Arundel set out on a fast horse through the streets of the capital, on the road to Mary at Framlingham, the rest of the Privy Council headed for Cheapside to tell the people their decision. Big crowds had assembled, waiting to hear what the councillors have to say. When they broke the news, the city erupted in celebrations. There were bonfires without number, and people singing in the street for joy.
The reaction when Mary's proclaimed queen in Cheapside is one of complete elation. Everyone is utterly overjoyed that she has at last come into her birthright. And there are all these wonderful accounts and reports of the celebrations that were staged and took place there. And the Tudor historian John Stowe records that there were all these bonfires, that people were leaping around in the streets and dancing, that Te Deum was sang, that there was wine flowing through the streets.
From this moment on, each of those who later told their story cast Northumberland as the instigator of the coup. He was the man driven by ambition, the bully, the tyrant, the traitor. History is written by the winners, those who survived to tell the tale. Throughout the 16th century, Privy Councillors had to confront crises over the succession to the throne. And those who survive are those who make the right call at the critical moment. Messengers from the Privy Council in Baynard's Castle are sent to the Tower to pass on the news that the Council have switched sides and Jane can no longer hold on to power. How did Jane in the Tower find out that her reign was over?
Well, the Privy Council sent a military force to tell her father that Jane was no longer queen and that Mary had been proclaimed. They weren't sure how Henry Grey would react, but when this force arrived, he simply said, "I am just one man." There was nothing he could do to defend his daughter's rights as queen any longer. And he went to tell her that she was no longer queen.
The Pope's envoy described the scene. Henry Grey entered the room where his daughter was sitting in state and removed the cloth of state from over her head as clear demonstration of what had to follow. He delivered the news that it was all over. There was no anger, no tears. Jane hadn't chosen to take the crown. Now she said that she would give it up as gladly as she had accepted it.
And she said, "Can I go home now?" In a very innocent sort of way. It's almost as though she's had to put on this persona of a queen and play the role for several days. And it must have been enormously exhausting, all of this stress and worry and not knowing what's happening from one minute to the next. And then she's told, okay, it's over, and it's like, whew, can I go back to being me again and not Queen of England?
And a young woman who has found the strength to inhabit that role for 9 days in a situation of such stress and crisis, then suddenly displaying the naivety to think that there was any chance that she might be allowed to go home.
And that almost makes us wonder, you know, if she is so intelligent and she is so insightful of what's going on around her, it's almost as though she lost all of that for a moment.
Jane and her father no longer command the Tower. Instead, they're arrested. Her fortress now becomes her prison. What happened next when Jane had changed from queen to prisoner?
She was stripped of her valuables, down to her small change. She was then escorted from the royal apartments to this small house on Tower Green, which belonged to the gentleman jailer, Nathaniel Partridge.
The house is still within the confines of the tower, but very different accommodation.
Yes, it's a world away in terms of status. In one, she would sit on essentially what was a throne under a canopy of state in great rooms hung with tapestries as a queen. And now she was appropriately in a small house as simply Lady Jane Dudley, the wife of a commoner.
When the news reaches Northumberland in Cambridge, he knows he's facing a traitor's death. Fox's Book of Martyrs, A Protestant History, describes a man in crisis. In desperation, he proclaims Mary queen, and so laughed that the tears ran down his cheeks for grief. The Duke of Northumberland had not been born to high office. He'd fought his way to the top. He'd come so close to making Jane queen and his own son, Guildford, king. And now, it's all over. On the 20th of July, just 10 days after Jane entered the Tower as Queen, Jane's own uncle, the Earl of Arundel, leads a deputation from the council to offer their allegiance to Mary. The Earl, once one of Northumberland's closest allies, denounces the Duke and delivers the news that the Privy Council have abandoned Jane's cause and have proclaimed Mary Queen on the streets of the capital.
What happened when the Earl of Arundel and his colleagues arrived at Framlingham to tell Mary that they'd changed sides?
Well, one of the first things they did was to beg for her pardon. And the imperial ambassadors describe how they went on their knees and they pointed a dagger at their own stomachs to demonstrate that they deserved death, but they were nevertheless asking her, out of her royal mercy, to grant them pardon.
And did Mary forgive them?
Mary did. Mary had wanted to forgive them from the beginning. She had been determined to reassure the elite that if they came to her, if they took her side, that it would be a safe thing to do, that she would forgive them, and it would all be put behind them.
Mary summoned Arundel. Whether it was reward for his present devotion to Mary or punishment for his past devotion to Northumberland, Mary gave him one task. The Duke of Northumberland is still in Cambridge when Mary's troops come for him. The man who arrests him on the orders of the new Queen is his former ally and friend, the Earl of Arundel.
When Arundel brought Northumberland back to the Tower on the 25th of July, the streets were crammed with people. He was pelted with stones and rocks, and the crowds cried, "Traitor."
The views of the people are key to this story. We could say Mary won because she had superior forces. But why did she have superior forces? Because the people didn't believe in Jane. Jane's story tells us a lot about what we take to be the rules of government. We often assume it's a matter of technicalities, abiding by the letter of the law. But the competing claims of 1553 show that isn't necessarily so. Jane was proclaimed queen by the regime in power, according to the will of the dead king. But that idea didn't fly with the people. They knew that Mary was Henry VIII's daughter. Even if the law said that she was illegitimate, they believed that she, not Jane, was the rightful Queen of England. And if you can't get your people to obey you, then what kind of a queen can you really claim to be? On the 3rd of August, 2 weeks after Jane's reign had ended, Mary Tudor entered London to take control of the Tower. Crowds lined the streets. One Tudor chronicler who witnessed the events noted, "Her gown of purple velvet with sleeves of the same, Her kirtle, purple satin, all thick-set with goldsmith's work and a great pearl. Her palfrey, that's her horse, that she rode on, richly trapped with gold embroidered to the horse's feet. Mary was a vision of royal splendor. She was every bit the queen that people wanted to see. Mary quickly turned to the matter of Jane Grey and what to do with her. Against the advice of those around her who cried for blood, Mary looked for a bloodless resolution.
Mary knew it was politic at that beginning of her reign, after regetting the throne, to be merciful, other than, of course, to Northumberland and the people most involved in what she saw as this plot to divert, which it was, of course, plot to divert the succession. So Jane is actually, really, I mean, for the best part of 6 months, kept in confinement in the Tower.
Jane and her young husband, Guildford Dudley, were imprisoned in separate quarters. Guildford was a prisoner in the Beauchamp Tower, and Jane was held for some time in Nathaniel Partridge's house, on this site here. We know that Jane was kept at the house of a Tower officer, but the location of the prison for the Dudleys is written into the walls.
Often graffiti is the only way we know where specific prisoners were held. And in the Beauchamp Tower, there's the most extraordinary graffiti relating to the Dudley family.
It's an elaborate piece left behind by Guildford's brother John, the Earl of Warwick, who was imprisoned with him in the Tower.
You can tell it's him as Earl of Warwick because it has a bear and a ragged staff, which is the image of Warwick. And then it's surrounded by flowers which represent his brothers. So there's a rose for Ambrose, gillyflowers for Guildford, it's all very cheesy, honeysuckle for Henry. And also there's a verse underneath which basically says those people who see this will understand why it's here and will be able to seek out the 4 brothers represented.
Jane and Guildford would be spared, for now at least. But what of Jane's father? Jane's mother, Frances Grey, had been close to Mary, and if anyone could save the life of Henry Grey, then it would be her. Jane's mother, predictably, pleaded that the Grey family had been victims of Northumberland. She claimed to have evidence that her husband had fallen ill because he'd been poisoned by the evil Duke. Remarkably, Mary was persuaded. The blame, she felt, should be Northumberland's. He was the sole architect of the coup. The ultimate crime of treason was his, and his alone. Jane's father was pardoned and set free, but on the 18th of August, the Duke of Northumberland was put on trial in Westminster Hall. Here he was confronted by many of his former colleagues from the Privy Council who had switched sides to Mary. The outcome was never in doubt. He was sentenced to a public execution on Tower Hill. The day before his death, the Duke, the scourge of Catholics across the country, the man who had ferociously suppressed the old faith, fell back on the one course of action that might have saved his life. Northumberland, the great religious reformer, attended a Catholic Mass, and he declared to all those present, "I do most faithfully believe this is the very right and true way, out of which true religion you and I have been seduced these 16 years past by the false and erroneous preaching of the new preachers." But if he thought his plea might save his life, he was wrong. On the 22nd of August, thousands of people crowded onto Tower Hill for Northumberland's very public beheading. Was Northumberland really to blame for everything that happened? Was he alone responsible for the coup, or was he a convenient scapegoat for others who wanted to distance themselves from the events of July 1553?
I think that's the big question, isn't it? That's what's been debated for almost 500 years. Was he this sort of scheming Machiavellian who takes this poor, innocent young girl and places her on the throne? Or was he a genuinely sort of caring person who cared about his country, cared about his family, was educated and talented?
You don't see Northumberland as the Machiavellian figure pulling the strings behind the dying Edward. You would see him as a player attempting to preserve his own position as the board is moving rapidly around him.
People want to say he's a Rasputin-esque, or as you say, Machiavellian type figure. I don't buy into that at all. I just don't see it. It was entirely normal for people in this period to seek personal advantage. And that he did so, he was simply reflecting the culture in which he lived. He was doing what everyone else around him did.
We do know what Jane herself thought of Northumberland.
On the 29th of August, Partridge threw a dinner party, and those present included the author of the Chronicle of Queen Jane, the most reliable source, and Jane herself. And in the course of that dinner, well, they must have clearly been reflecting on, the general situation and what had happened. Jane suddenly denounces Northumberland and says that he was the source of all her and her family's troubles, and the reason for this was Northumberland's exceeding ambition.
Jane remained in the house of Nathaniel Partridge for several months. And during this time, there was growing tension between Mary, who wanted to save Jane, and those around her who were calling for Jane's death. A trial was inevitable.
On the 13th of November, Jane was led out of the tower. It was the first time she'd left the fortress since she'd entered it as queen in early July. Now she walked through the streets, a single mile to the Guildhall, where she faced a public trial.
Jane could have been tried in Westminster Hall and taken by water privately on a barge, but instead of this, she was processed through the streets on foot. A treason trial at this period was not a trial in the way we understand it. It wasn't about discovering guilt or innocence. It was essentially a morality play. And this morality play was a demonstration of Jane's guilt. She was dressed very dramatically, entirely in black, and she had hanging from her belt a prayer book. She was setting herself up as an example of Protestant piety.
Jane was tried alongside her husband, Guildford.
The trial opens with a Catholic liturgy, which Jane must have found extremely irritating and upsetting. Nevertheless, she listens calmly to the accusations laid against her of treason, which include her signing her documents as Jane the Queen, and she pleads guilty to treason, as does her husband, Guildford, who is on trial with her. At the end of the trial, entirely predictably, she is found guilty and condemned to death, either by burning or by beheading at the Queen's pleasure. Guildford is to be hanged, drawn, and quartered.
But was Jane guilty? She was a teenage girl who'd played no part in planning to take the throne.
Was Jane an innocent victim?
Depends on how you define innocent. In purely legal terms, probably not, because she did actively participate in the events of her reign. She asserted herself and refused to make Guildford king. She willingly signed documents, repeatedly, numerous documents. She took the action of locking her privy councillors into the tower. All of those are very positive moves on her part to assert herself as monarch. So legally, no, she's not innocent.
But in an extraordinary act of leniency, Mary suspended Jane's sentence. She continued to resist those around her who wanted Jane dead.
Mary's somebody actually who, particularly at the stage of her reign, is generous. She's merciful. She's also very pragmatic because she knows it'll actually be rather wise to build up as much support as possible by being lenient where she can.
Mary needs to bring people together, not divide them.
to consign the crisis to history as quickly as she can.
It's well within Mary's character that because Jane was family, you know, even despite all that had happened, she could have brought her into her court and rehabilitated her. She did rehabilitate various other young women. It's perfectly possible.
But unlike the Duke of Northumberland, Jane was not prepared to change her faith at any price.
She was the sort of person we might recognize today. She's a sort of teenage religious ideologue who's prepared to die for her religious cause.
Jane had one way of reaching the outside world. As a child, she had been schooled in writing letters, a skill that had traditionally been a male preserve.
Women are able to, because they're able to write, are able to express themselves on paper. These are privy and powerful communications. You know, letters here are a sort of a political tool.
As Queen, Jane had signed letters prepared by professional scribes. Now she put her own skills to work and gave full vent to her faith with no concern for the consequences.
She hears that Mary has re-legalized the Catholic Mass. So the Catholic Mass can be said again in England. Jane violently disapproves of Catholic Mass. She describes it as a sort of form of satanic cannibalism. And she wants people to make a stand against it. And so she writes an open letter to a former tutor of hers who's converted to Catholicism and says to people they should rise again in Christ's war.
At the very moment when Jane needs to be appealing to Mary, as her life hangs in the balance, the writing of this letter is remarkable.
It's a very forceful letter full of extremely strong language, even name-calling, telling this person that he's going to become, you know, the spawn of Satan if he doesn't recant and come back to Protestantism, etc., violating all sorts of social norms. I mean, she's speaking to, this is a young girl speaking to a man. This is a young person speaking to an older person. This is a student speaking to her former teacher. And in each of those roles, she's reversed it and become the authority, the teacher, the parent, the guide.
I mean, she may not literally have meant go out, put on your suit of armor and chop off Mary Tudor's head, but not that far from it, really.
The extraordinary thing is that Mary overlooks this letter. Even now, she won't sign Jane's death warrant. But Jane is left languishing in the Tower of London, isolated from the world. The process of wiping away the pictures and records of Jane the Queen begins. And after all this time looking for traces of Jane, I still don't know what she looks like.
We live in an era today of visual media. You know, visual images are around us everywhere. And we want to see what these people look like. And unfortunately, we don't have a reliable, authentic, documentable portrait of Jane Grey.
Jane almost seems to be a ghost slipping through our fingers. What are the options for the possible images that we might look at to try to see Jane's face?
There's really only one at the moment that gives us reasonably reliable indication of her appearance, and that's a portrait at Sion House.
If there were ever more paintings of Jane, then it's possible they were destroyed as she awaited execution, condemned as a traitor.
Traitors, people who've had their heads chopped off, pictures of them don't survive because, you know, if you've got a traitor in the family, you don't want to boast about it. You don't want to say Great Aunt Maud when it was a traitor, at least not when you're living during the Tudor era.
The Sion picture, long said to be Jane Grey, was analysed in 2013 by experts able to date the wood it was painted on.
It was painted 50 years after she died, but we do know that it was commissioned by someone who had actually known Jane.
So here it is. This is as good as it gets. Now Jane was out of sight, she was out of mind. The new Queen, Mary, was focused on her own future. She had announced her intention to marry Philip of Spain, who was Catholic and a foreigner, and on both counts caused her people unease. For the 4 months that Jane had been imprisoned, Mary had also been working to undo her brother's Protestant reforms. Proclamations were amended and laws reversed. The Mass and the Old Prayer Book were reintroduced, and Catholicism, with all of its ritual, returned. Jane glimpsed the world through narrow windows and conversations with the few who still came to visit, including her father, Henry Grey. But while she was in prison, another plot was being hatched. In January 1554, Thomas Wyatt, a Protestant gentleman, raised 4,000 men to march on London to remove Mary from the throne. We don't know if Jane knew about it, but she was implicated all the same.
Alongside Wyatt, one of the rebel leaders was a man who had worked for so long to advance the Protestant cause, her own father.
Jane would have heard that the Rising collapsed in violence and chaos and was routed by the forces of the Crown.
She would have heard that the leaders were captured and tried, and she would have had no doubt of the consequences for those involved.
Hundreds of men were sentenced to die. Many would be hanged, and the worst offenders were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered.
It would be a violent and terrible bloodletting as a statement of the authority of the Crown.
And there could be no pardon for Jane's father this time. Mary had forgiven him once. She couldn't forgive him again. He would be executed. When Jane refused to let her father lead the army to confront Mary in Framlingham, she probably saved his life. And had her father lived a quiet life at court under the new regime, there's a chance Jane could have been saved. But now her father's actions were what sealed Jane's fate. While she was alive, she became a symbol, a rallying point for rebel Protestants. Mary couldn't let her live.
Mary signed the death warrant for Northumberland's son Guildford, and for Jane too. The executions would take place in 5 days' time.
And for Jane's father, perhaps the greatest punishment of all, he would live long enough to know his daughter had been beheaded. Jane would die on the same day as her husband, Guildford before Jane.
The vast majority of executions associated with the Tower of London happened outside the castle on Tower Hill, in public, for justice to be seen to be done. And of course, that's what happens to Guildford Dudley. But for Jane herself, she's one of a very privileged group of people who were actually executed more privately within the castle itself. Between 1483 and 1941, there are 22 executions that happen within the confines of the tower. And Jane is one of 5 women who are executed within the castle, and one of 3 queens, the other 2 being Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard.
There is an account of Jane's private execution, which is the most reliable description of this infamous event. It's in the Chronicle of Queen Jane, written by someone who was present inside the tower.
Jane, we're told, was nothing at all abashed, neither with fear of her own death, neither with the sight of the dead carcass of her husband. She came forth, the lieutenant leading her, in the same gown wherein she was arraigned, neither her eyes anything moisted with tears, although her 2 gentlewomen, Mistress Elizabeth Tilney and Mistress Ellen, wonderfully wept. Jane carried a book in her hand, whereon she prayed all the way till she came to the said scaffold.
Another source says that she conducted herself at her execution with the greatest fortitude and godliness. It's a terrifying thought. Jane had to walk out here, lay her head on the block, and wait for the blade. When we talk about Tudor history, we use words like beheading without thinking too much about them. But Jane's death was a moment of horror. She was executed on the 12th of February 1554, dressed head to foot in black, carrying a prayer book in her hand, supported by two devoted gentlewomen. It may be the end of Jane's life, but this is where the enduring fascination with the 9 Days Queen begins. The story of how this young woman met her death has been repeated throughout history, and in the process, her execution has become shrouded in myth. There's another famous description of her execution. It's an account published in the weeks after Jane's death by an underground Protestant press. In other words, by someone who had an interest in making Jane a perfect Protestant martyr. It describes her last moments in heart-rending detail. "Shall I say this psalm?" And he said yes. Then she said the psalm of Miserere mei Deus, in English, in most devout manner to the end. Then she stood up and gave her maid, Mistress Tilney, her gloves and handkerchief, and her book to Master Thomas Bridges, the lieutenant's brother. Then the hangman kneeled down and asked her forgiveness, whom she forgave most willingly. Then he willed her to stand upon the straw, which doing, she saw the block. Then she said, "I pray thee, dispatch me quickly." Then she kneeled down, saying, "Will you take it off before I lay me down?" And the hangman answered her, "No, madam." She tied the handkerchief about her eyes, then, feeling for the block, said, "What shall I do? Where is it?" One of the standers-by guiding her thereunto, she laid her head down upon the block and stretched forth her body and said, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And so she ended. It's full of pathos, but it's an example of how Jane's story has been embellished because it was added in to the eyewitness chronicle of Queen Jane when it was published in the 19th century.
Now, when this was edited in 1850 by John Gough Nichols, who was a very distinguished historian, he altered the text. This is very, very hard to believe, but he added new text that he believed to have been written by the original chronicler that he had found elsewhere. They were texts that were circulating quite widely, even in the 16th century. But he added them for the extraordinary reason, and this is the thing about Jane Grey that you couldn't possibly have made up. He added it because he'd recently seen Paul Delaroche's painting. All the pathos, all the drama of the version of the story that has Jane Grey, you know, coming up to the scaffold and then sort of basically fumbling with the blindfold and then groping for the block and asking the executioner, you know, "Are you going to do it before I've actually knelt down at the block?" And he says no, and then saying the psalm, you know, basically, "Have mercy upon me, O Lord." And the wonderful theatrical, dramatized creation of Jane as this innocent victim and Protestant martyr. That is not in the chronicle of Jane Grey.
The 19th century editor was inspired to include this description of Jane's execution in the otherwise eyewitness chronicle by one of the most popular portraits in the National Gallery. The execution of Lady Jane Grey was painted by the French artist Paul Delaroche over 250 years after Jane died.
What it is not is a historical reconstruction of the actual circumstances, insofar as we can know them, of Jane Grey's execution.
The painting was first shown in 1834, 30 years after the end of the French Revolution.
If you put somebody with an axe and you have a young woman in the foreground who is about to be beheaded, inevitably this brings up the issues of French history which were perhaps too raw to be depicted at that particular time in their own right.
The image of an archetypal innocent facing the block was a particularly resonant one in post-revolutionary France. What Delaroche was not striving for was historical accuracy about 16th century England.
That is such a rubbish image. The only thing accurate in that image really is the straw on the floor. And beyond that, it is entirely almost histrionic, dramatic evocation of an idea rather than a depiction of an individual.
Do you think the difficulty of seeing Jane's face is one of the things that's left space for the crowding in of myth about her, that it's harder to have a sense of her as a real person?
It makes it very difficult to render her concrete. So there is kind of a mystery and a vagueness about it that leaves room for infill.
At times, those gaps in the record have left room for complete invention. One of the best examples appears in The 9 Days Queen, written by Richard Davey and published in 1909. This is the book, and his source is a letter from a Genoese merchant called Baptist Spinola. The letter says, "This Jane is very short and thin, but prettily shaped and graceful. She has small features and a well-made nose, the mouth flexible and the lips red. Her headdress was a white coif with many jewels. The new queen was mounted on very high chopines, that's a kind of platform shoe, to make her look much taller, which were concealed by her robes, as she is very small and short." But here are the pitfalls of history. This, after her execution, the most often repeated detail in the story of Jane Grey, turns out to be a historical fraud. And that rich merchant, Baptist Spinola, probably never existed.
It fulfills people's expectations. They want a pretty girl who looks vulnerable and fragile, surrounded by sort of big adults. You know, there she is in her stacked shoes, and she's smiling just as she enters the tower.
From the moment she died, people have mythologized and misrepresented Lady Jane Grey. But there's one object that allows us to hear Jane's own voice from beyond the grave. Her prayer book.
So this is the book she actually carried onto the scaffold and handed over just before the blindfolding and the kneeling.
It is, yes, yes. It's quite incredible, isn't it? What makes it even more special, one of the great treasures of the British Library, Jane wrote some messages in it.
One is a heartfelt message to her father.
She writes, "The Lord comfort your grace, and that in the word wherein all creatures can only be comforted.
And though it hath pleased God to take away 2 of your children, yet think not that you have lost them, but trust that we, by leaving this mortal life, have won an immortal life."
And then she signs it, "Your Grace's humble daughter, Jane Dudley."
She's no longer Jane the Queen.
In another message, she writes to the Catholic gentleman who had been in charge of the tower during her time in prison.
"I shall, as a friend, desire you, and as a Christian, require you, call upon God to incline your heart to his laws, and to not take the word of truth utterly out of your mouth, but live to die, live still to die." So she's saying, don't be misguided by false teachings. And of course, by that she means Roman Catholicism.
Once we strip away the layers of myth and exaggeration, the Jane we find is devout, unflinching, composed to the end. But the one thing she could never be is the one thing that might have made a difference to her chances of keeping the throne. Her cousin Edward's plan for the succession makes it clear that he thought a man should wear the crown.
One word gets repeated over and over again. Male, 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 heirs male.
To hold power meant to be male.
Women were considered to be creatures of emotion rather than of reason.
Edward's plan had been to keep women off the throne for good.
No one has yet looked at it as a gender issue as opposed to a pure political power religious issue.
But as it turned out, Jane's 9-day reign was part of a critical moment in English history. She was overthrown by her female rival, Mary, who would rule England for 5 years. When Mary died, Elizabeth followed her onto the English throne. Another woman, another queen. Like Jane, she was a religious reformer. Unlike Jane, she ruled for 45 years. And Elizabeth learned a lot from Jane's brief reign.
It's very important in the impact it has on Elizabeth. Why is she the Virgin Queen? Well, she saw what happened to Jane when Jane married Guildford Dudley, and how that helped undermine her position. She's seen how little she can trust the nobility, the Protestant nobility, who are supposed to be her chief backers. Elizabeth has seen how they can't be trusted, but how the ordinary people might help to save her.
So Jane's 9 days do leave a legacy. But was she Lady Jane Grey or Queen Jane?
Would you count Jane as a Queen of England? Or was this a failed coup that we shouldn't include in the line of English monarchs?
She reigned for 9 days. She was a Queen of England. A contested queen, but a queen nonetheless.
1553 was an extraordinary moment in English history. For the first time ever, all possible heirs to the crown were female. The men who surrounded the throne imagined that the only way a mere woman could rule was as their puppet. That's why they chose Jane Grey. But in her 9 days as queen, Jane began to show them they were wrong. It was a lesson hammered home by her cousin and rival, Mary. And the example of these two women in the summer of 1553 demonstrated that a queen could rule without a man to control her if she had the support of England's people. We call her Lady Jane Grey, not Queen Jane, because we know how her story ended. But in reliving the drama of her 9-day reign, we're reminded just how close she came to ruling England and how different things could have been.